This week I have for you an eerie and atmospheric story sent to me by a viewer named No Crust Please, called We Found the Thing That Killed a Kid in the Woods. At a water tower turned local hotspot, 4 friends theorize about what happened to the kid that died there. But they soon discover the truth firsthand, the truth that lurks in the woods below. When you see something pursuing you in the woods, and it's faster than you are, just keep going, and pray that it's not as hungry as it is fast. This happened the summer I was 13, in a little town in Indiana. We had maybe 4,000 people there, one of those Midwest places with a grain elevator and a ton of churches. And it also had this water tower out past the edge of town. You could see it from almost anywhere. The town's name was painted on the side in letters, which have by now completely faded away. But that tower is the reason I'm telling you a story today. My friends and I used to climb that tower at night. This was the late 80s. Back then, a kid could vanish out of his own house after dark, as long as he had a story, and we let our parents know when we'd be back. And we always had a story. You told your folks you were staying over at someone's house, and that somebody told his folks he was staying at yours. And as long as the 2 sets of parents never got on the phone with each other, you had the whole night to yourself. We spent a lot of those nights at the tower. There were 4 of us that ran together that summer. Cooch was the loud guy. Brian was almost as loud and never shut up. He always had a story to tell, and his older brother was constantly the one feeding him those stories. Denny was a quiet guy and went along with whatever. You could never tell if he was into something or completely against it, because he just wouldn't say. Then there was me, who mostly remembers being the one paying attention while the other 3 carried the night. We'd been friends since grade school. In a town that size, there are only so many kids your age, and you don't get to pick, so you take the ones you've got. The tower we quote-unquote found the summer before. I don't remember the specifics, but one of us got dared to climb it. Definitely wasn't me, but after that it became ours. By that I mean our friend group's tower. Getting up the tower was the easy part. A ladder ran up one of the legs with the safety cage long gone, and a catwalk wrapped the whole way around the tank up top. From the catwalk, you could see the entire town laid out below. The streetlights, a lit sign at the marathon station, and the dark squares of bean fields. We'd haul up a couple of sleeping bags and a cooler, and we'd sit there with our backs against the cool steel of the tank, staying up most of the night. It was higher than it sounds. The whole structure had a little give to it in the wind, a slow sway you stopped noticing eventually, and the tank would tick and groan now and then. Someone told me once it was the steel cooling. But it spooked me the first few times I heard it, but then it turned into part of the place's charm. Being up there, you felt like you were getting away with something cool, just by sitting up there, 100 feet over a town that thought you were asleep in bed. The cooler was Cooch's job. His uncle kept a second refrigerator in his garage, and he kept nothing in it but beer, cans stacked on cans, and his uncle put away enough of it that he never noticed a few going missing. Cooch would lift a 6-pack at a time, never getting caught. So there we'd be, the 4 of us, 13 and 14 years old, passing around warm beer we didn't even like yet, telling stories. But the stories were the real reason we climbed up there. There was a story we always came back around to. That one was true, or true enough that it had been in the papers. 3 summers ago, back then I mean, a kid named Aaron Pruitt had been found dead up on this very catwalk. He was 16, a couple of grades ahead of us. We'd all known who he was. You know, small town and all that. A man walking his dog along the old road here had seen something he thought was a body, so he called it in. And he was right. When the fire department went up, Aaron was lying on the catwalk, and he had been dead a day or 2. It was tragic, sure, but what got everybody, though, was the way he was found. He had died of thirst. Dehydration, the official word was. A healthy 16-year-old boy found dead of thirst on top of the town's entire water supply. 1,000,000 gallons of it, sitting right there under him behind a 1/4 inch of steel. The coroner's explanation was that Aaron had been on some kind of drug that ran his body dry, then put him out before he could do anything about it. You can't desperately drink some water when you're passed out. That was the story that made the paper, and the story the school sent a letter home about. The letter left a certain part out, though, as the trouble with that story was that there were no drugs found in Aaron. None. We got it from Denny's mom, who worked at that clinic, and once you've heard a thing like that, you don't forget it. I remember a little bit about Aaron. Not much. He bagged groceries at the IGA and had a loud car he was proud of. Once he chased a bunch of us off the tower property back when he was the big kid and we were the little ones, which is a funny thing to think about now. After he died, the town did about what you'd expect. There was a funeral the whole high school went to, and for a few weeks the sheriff parked a car out by that road by the water tower so kids would stay away. But eventually he had to stop. He couldn't just stay there every night. The grown-ups of the town settled on the drug explanation, and everything went back to normal. Nobody thought deeper of it. I tried to after hearing about the drug thing, because the first thought I had of a healthy boy dying of thirst on a water tower, well, that made me think he was stuck. And why would a boy be stuck up there and rather die than climb down? But anyway, they put that idea to bed, because the grown-ups didn't want to think about that. It was the kids, us, who wouldn't let the story and the theories die. We were just around 13, and as the trauma left us, as time usually helps with, it was obvious that Aaron's demise was a very good ghost story, and a bit of a conspiracy. So yeah, legends started up. Some kids figured Aaron had gone up to meet a girl who never showed up, and he lost his mind out there alone, maybe from the heartbreak. Others said somebody had dared him, and for some reason or another he couldn't get back down. The younger kids decided the tower was cursed, and the water was evil, and that if you ever drank out of the tank directly, you would end up like Aaron. The version the 4 of us liked the most, which we retold constantly up there at 2 in the morning with a warm can going around, was that there had been something on the tower with him. We said it had kept him up there, and every time Aaron tried to climb down, it set him back on the catwalk, and it stayed with him the whole time. And that was how a strong kid died of thirst right next to 1,000,000 gallons of water, and never got back down a ladder he had climbed up. We'd been at this a couple of summers by the night I'm telling you about. We'd worn that story clean out. Somebody would do the part about it setting Aaron back on the catwalk in a spooky voice, and somebody else would throw a bottle cap at him, and we'd all laugh. The tower was just our place. It was creepy to us in a good way. That was the whole point of going. Nothing real ever happened up there. Nothing real ever happened in that town at all, except for Aaron. We didn't think anything could happen. The tower stood about 1.5 miles out, on the far side of a piece of woods everybody called the tract. Nobody farmed it, and nobody built on it. You rode the dirt road out past the last few houses, dropped your bike in the tall weeds where a fence line came down to meet the road, and you walked in along a forest path. It was around a 10-minute walk back to the clearing where the tower stood. By day, the tract was nothing special, your typical local woods. But the trees grew very close together, so the canopy completely blotted out the sky when you were in there. Even at noon, it felt like the sun was setting. At night, and with no moon especially, it was as dark as space itself. We always went in before dark and came out in the morning, so I had never once walked that path in the middle of the night. The night I'm telling you about was the back end of July, and it was hot. The sun went down and the heat just stayed. We'd all given our folks the usual. I had told mine I was staying over at Cooch's. Cooch had told his mom he was staying at my place. We'd covered for each other like that all summer, and it always worked before. We met at the fence line a little after 9, hiding our bikes in the weeds. Then we walked in while there was still enough light to find the path. We were up on that catwalk with the cooler before it went full dark. It was a good night at the start. We had 2 six-packs and a bag of chips, and a little transistor radio Brian had brought along that only pulled in one station clear, a country station out of the city that not one of us would admit to liking. But just between me and you, I loved it. We sat up there, watching the lights come on across town, giving each other a hard time and getting started on that beer. Cooch could already drink more than the rest of us and wanted us to know it. Denny went quiet and a little green after 2, but he acted like he was just fine. It was just about the most typical version of a night out there. We talked about varsity and girls, mainly who's out of whose league. We debated about whether Cooch could actually take Brian in a fight, which we never settled that one. Brian had a deck of cards and we played a few hands of something, then quit, because nobody could agree on the rules in the dark. The radio drifted in and out. A train went through town way off, and we listened to it the whole way across, the horn fading down the line. Then it was quiet, except for us. Once it was completely dark, we got into the stories. Brian started us off. He did the one about the hitchhiker with the hook, and Cooch followed it with the one he swore had happened to his own cousin. Then, inevitably, someone brought up Aaron. We were sitting around on a dead kid's grave, more or less, and that was the appeal of it. That night, Brian had something new to add. He said his older brother had told him that when they brought Aaron's body down, his fingers were all torn up, the fingernails especially, like he had been clawing at something. And the thing he'd been clawing at, Brian said, was the steel of the tank, because at the very end, Aaron had been trying to dig his way through to the water. Brian said if you knew where to look, you could still see the scratches up near the top of the tank. "You're so full of it," Cooch said. "Ask my brother," Brian said. "Your brother's full of it too." Nobody said anything for a few seconds after that. The detail in that story was just a little too good, so it stuck with us. Then Danny said he was going to be sick, and went over to do the sick off the far rail of the catwalk. We laughed at him. Brian turned up the radio then. The station was playing something slow and we all groaned about it. Things felt ordinary again. I remember being happy, dumb, complete. It was sometime past midnight when the headlights came. We saw them before we heard anything. 2 beams swinging in off the country road and stopping right where the fence line met it, right where we'd left the bikes. A truck. It sat there with the lights on, aimed into the trees. All 4 of us stopped talking and watched. For a second, I think every one of us landed on the same word. Cops. And Cooch started to say that we should hide the cooler. But then we heard the horn honk, 2 short honks and then a long one. And I knew whose it was before my brain had caught up. My dad honked exactly like that, pulling into our own driveway. 2 short honks and a long one every single time. My stomach did a knot. Then his voice came up out of the dark, all the way across the tract. There was no mistaking it. He yelled my name once. He only ever said it that way when I was in big trouble, and we both knew it. The other 3 looked over at me. Nobody was laughing now. There was nothing I could do but go. If I made him come in there after me, it would be 10 times worse, and the other guys knew that as well as I did. Cooch said good luck and didn't mean it as a joke for once. I grabbed a flashlight from up on the catwalk before starting down. We had 2 of the things. One was a little plastic one that took a square 9-volt. It was basically a little pinprick of nothing light. The other was a big silver mag light that Brian's dad used for hunting, heavy as a club, 4D batteries in it. And Brian had only brought it along that night by luck. I took the big one, leaving the little one behind. I went down the ladder and no one said a word. The climb down took a while, what with the flashlight in one hand and my dad's voice still hanging in the air over the woods. I was nervous. Soon I was at the bottom, standing in the trees at the head of the path. The path looked different from down there at night. In the daytime, you didn't even think about it being a path. Just a nice gap where people walked. Now it was a narrow, dark tunnel running back under the trees, and the maglite only reached so far into it before the dark closed in around it. I stood there a second longer than I needed to. Then my dad's voice came across the woods again. My name sharper this time. So I went in. The path was easy enough at first. The maglite put out a strong white circle. I kept it on the dirt a few feet ahead of me and walked briskly. The summer woods there at night are loud, all bugs and frogs and little things shifting around in the brush. With all of that going on, it was almost a comfort. The noise meant everything was normal, even if I was in big trouble. My head was full of my dad and what I was about to walk into out of that road, and how long I was going to be grounded for. I wasn't even thinking about Aaron Pruitt. The stories of that boy were the last thing on my mind. I'd made it halfway there when all the bugs stopped. It didn't happen all at once. It was like the noise went quiet in front of me as I walked. A pocket of quiet that moved when I moved, so that I kept walking into silence, pulling it along with me. You notice a thing like that a beat too late, after it's already happened, or after it's already gone. I stopped then, and that quiet stopped with me. Underneath it, I could hear the woods around me like normal, except in my little pocket of silence. I lifted the light up off the path and swung it out into the trees. That was a mistake. The second the beam moved, everything it wasn't pointed at went pure black. The trunks jumped and slid around in the light like they were moving, even though I knew they weren't. I put the beam back down on the path and moved a little faster. That was when I saw it for the first time, out at the edge of the light, right before the white light went to black. Something tall stepped from behind one tree to hide behind another. It was quick and smooth. It was gone before I could get the light onto it. I stopped again, aiming the maglite back where it had gone, but I didn't see anything there. Only trunks and the path. I stood with my heart beating hard, and I stared at the spot I saw it. A deer, I thought. There were deer all over the tract. I'd spooked one, and it bolted. That's what happened. But wouldn't a deer make noise? A deer crashing off through brush in the dark is about the loudest thing in those woods. Branches snapping and hooves coming down. This had not made a sound, and a deer is low to the ground. The shape I'd seen go between those two trees had been upright, and it had been tall, taller than my own dad, and my dad was a big man. I stood there, frozen for a moment, before realizing I needed to keep walking. Standing still in the dark was a horrible idea. So I walked fast. The path was a pale line out ahead in the maglite, and I followed it, trying to keep my eyes straight forward. But that's not something you can just do. Not when you know something is back there. You have to look. Every few steps I would swing that light around, and I would catch the trees standing still. Then I'd face forward and walk. A few steps later I'd feel it again, that sense of something out there keeping pace with me, off to the side, matching me step for step. Every time I turned the light, it was gone. Or maybe it was already standing still and I just couldn't see it. But that pocket of quiet moved with me the whole way, and I knew it in my body. I was not walking through those woods alone. The path split once. I recognized that. You went right to get to the road, so I went right. I'd gone a little ways when I realized the path I was on was getting narrower than it should have been, and the ground had begun to slope down. There was no slope between the split and the road. I'd taken a wrong turn somehow, except there had only been the one split, and I'd gone right at it, the same as I'd gone right at it 100 times before. I stopped and turned around to head back to the split, and there stood that shape, right on the path with me. It was standing in the middle of the path, back where the light barely reached, a tall, straight shape with the trees behind it. It wasn't moving. It didn't have any shine in its eyes the way an animal's might. It didn't have anything I could make out for a face at all. It just stood there in the path between me and the split, and I stood there looking at it. Neither of us moved, and the only sound I could hear in that moment was my breathing coming too hard and too fast. I'm not sure how to describe being looked at by something with no eyes that I could find, but I am certain it was looking at me. I couldn't go forward. That's where it was. So I went off the path into the trees away from that shape, crashing through the brush with the mag light swinging all over. I had no idea where I was going. I'd gone a few hundred feet, breathing like a mad cow, when I came around the side of a big trunk, and it was there, in front of me now, the same tall shape, between two trees, so fast and yet somehow it had been waiting. I backed off and went a third way, and after a minute, the ground felt familiar again. Then I saw why. I was passing the same downed tree I'd already climbed over, a big rotted trunk with the roots torn up in a fan. I'd come around in a circle. I hadn't turned myself around. I'd kept going what I thought was straight, and the woods had bent me back to the same dead tree. I stood next to it with the flashlight shaking, and I still had no idea where I was, despite being where I'd walked 100 times during the day, only 10 minutes away from a country road. Somewhere off behind me, the horn went again, unmistakably my dad. That was just enough time for me to get a fix on where he was. Off to my left, not too far. I turned and went that way. That shape let me go a little ways. Suddenly it was off to my side again, pacing me. A tall nothing shape, slipping from tree to tree without making a single sound. What did it want? Was it chasing me? It was obviously much faster. If it was chasing me down, it would have already caught me. I think I was crying by then. I was gripping that maglite like a lifeline, and I was just moving, any direction now that the shape was not at. But sooner or later, every direction had the shape. I'm not sure how long this went on. It felt like an hour. What ended it were the lights. My dad's headlights, off through the trees to my right. I had been working my way back toward the road the whole time, and I didn't even know it. Was I allowed to make it out? No, I felt more like I was herded here. But I ran at that light, and I didn't look behind me this time, nor to the sides. I ran straight at the headlights, no matter what might be in the way. I broke through the trees, and I stumbled out onto the gravel ditch by the country road so hard I went down on my hands and knees, and the shape did not come out of those trees after me. My dad was standing at the open door of the truck, with the engine running and the lights on. When I came scrambling up out of that ditch, he really dug into me before I was even up on my feet. Where in the hell had I been? Did I have the first idea what time it was? So what happened was, Cooch's mother had called the house at 11, wanting to talk to Cooch, and my mother had told her Cooch wasn't here, and the two of them had the whole thing figured out before they'd even hung up the phone. He was loud and furious, and I had never in my life been so glad to have somebody yelling at me. I got in the truck. My hands were still shaking, and I had gravel ground into both palms and grass and dirt all down the front of me, but my dad was too worked up to notice any of it, and that was fine by me. If he actually noticed that, he would have demanded an explanation, and there was nothing I could have explained right then that he would have believed. We drove home, and he yelled for a while, then went quiet. I sat there looking out the window at the dark country going by, keeping my mouth shut. I didn't tell him about the woods. I thought about it, the whole drive home in fact. I didn't know if I should say a word or not. Eventually I decided if I did say a word, he would probably just take it for an excuse of my situation, or accuse me of being on drugs. So I kept it to myself. What this experience did to me that summer was it took my woods away. Not just the tower, but all the tract. I had grown up in and around those trees, the tract, the creek, and the fields behind them, like every kid in town. After that night, I couldn't make myself walk into the woods at dusk. Any woods, anywhere. I'd get up to the tree line and my feet would just stop. My mom decided I was getting too old for running around outside, which I didn't know was a thing, but I let her think that. I didn't go back to the tower for the rest of the summer. The other three kept at it, and they gave me heck over it, but I took it. Cooch decided I was scared of my dad, and I let him think that. It was easier than telling people the truth, which I wasn't ready to do. School started. They went to the tower less and less, and for a while the whole night just sat in the back of my head as one of the strangest things that ever happened to me. I figured I'd gotten lucky out there in the dark. I was able to make it out alive, with a story that I might be able to eventually tell. The next summer is when I found out how wrong I'd been. I went back the next summer. Nobody made me go. I had every reason on God's earth to stay away from that tower and the tract, and yet I found myself walking back to it on my own 2 feet. What happened in those woods the summer before had not gotten any smaller or lighter in my head, but time and memory did its thing, where it felt farther away, harder to hold on to. With experiences like that, they're the most real thing that's ever happened to you in the moment. But then a year of regular life goes by. Homework, sleepovers, ball games, girls, that kind of stuff just chips away at bad memories. And it gaslights you into believing that things are normal, like they used to be. By the next June, I had talked myself most of the way around to the idea that I had scared myself stupid in the dark, that I saw a deer, maybe some hobo or something, and I ran like a baby. I'd finally opened up to the guys about that story. Cooch had been telling everybody the hobo scared me silly version all year, and really I think that helped me to lie to myself about the experience. Being the kid who got scared is a hard thing to be at that age. It followed me around all year. It came up when teams got picked, and when somebody told a ghost story at a sleepover, they always looked over to me to see if I would flinch. To me, I had done the bravest thing I'd ever done, walking out of those woods alive, and as far as anybody knew, I'd run crying from a creepy hobo. By the time that hot summer came around, I think I wanted to go back, if not to just prove to everyone that something is out there, or to prove that I was not too scared to go back. At the time, I wasn't sure which one it was. Both of those things were stupid ideas. Why would I want to see that thing again? Or give it a chance to see me again? Stupid ideas like that, it's what gets kids killed. Not to mention it was a hard summer to stay inside for. It was pretty hot that year. Even the old men were complaining about it. A real drought, they said. The worst anybody could remember since blah. There was no rain to speak of from the middle of May onward. The corn out past town came up, then just quit. It started curling in on itself, the leaves going pale green, then rolling up tight like cigars. The creek where we swam all the time dropped down to a string of warm puddles with the minnows dying in them. They put the town on water rationing in July. No sprinklers and no washing cars. There was a joke going around, too, that we had all better hope the town didn't run dry. Everybody was short-tempered and sticky, looking for something to do after dark. The other thing going on that summer were the dogs. Somewhere that spring, a few farm dogs had gotten loose. They'd gotten in among a bunch of strays, turning into a pack, about 8 or 10 of them, running together out at the edge of town. They were getting into people's garbage. They got into a farmer's chickens one night, killing most of them. And a kid 2 grades under me named Petey got bit on the leg, bad enough that he had to have stitches. He had come around a corner on his bike right into the middle of this pack. After that, everybody had an opinion about the dogs. The sheriff said he would deal with it, and never did. And the thing all the parents told us, mine included, was that if the pack ever cornered you, you did not run. Running is the worst thing you can do with dogs, apparently. You threw them whatever food you had on you and you backed off slow and let them have at it. My dad must have told me that 5 times that summer. I'm glad now that he did. So that's the way that summer was. Hot and cruel, and everyone was bored and miserable. One evening near the end of July, Cooch and Brian came by on their bikes. They said they were riding out to the tower, and I was coming along. But before I could say anything, they added, "Or are you too scared of the dark still?" Denny was already in. I stood there in my own driveway, remembering that whole year of being the kid who was a chicken, and I said I was coming along. It was the easiest thing in the world to say, but I think it's the one decision I wish I could take back, even now. We rode out to the country road in the last of the light, with the heat still coming up off the black top. We dropped our bikes off at the fence line and walked the rest of the way in. For a year I'd been deciding the woods were only woods. Walking back into them, though, it called my bluff in a hurry. The second those trees closed over the top of us, I felt the old thing come back up the back of my neck. That animal sense of standing somewhere you have no business to be. And I kept it to myself, kept walking. There was just enough light left under the canopy to see by. Nothing moved that wasn't supposed to. We came out into the clearing, and there was the old tower, black against a sky that had not cooled off a single degree, but looking exactly as it always looked, and I took that for a good omen. We did our usual thing, except that night we had brought some hot dogs. Brian had a pack of them and a bag of buns going stale, and some family-sized chips. The plan was to make a little fire at the base, and cook before we climbed up, since none of us had eaten supper yet. We never made fires up on the catwalk. Seemed like a bad idea. There was no room and no reason to, anyway. Down at the base in the clearing, it was fine. So Cooch got a small fire going in the ring of rocks that had been there as long as we had, and we roasted hot dogs on sticks, eating them half-burnt and talking. And for a while, it was the best night of my summer. Building a fire in a drought was about the only thing dumber than the rest of what we were doing. But it was a little one, and the ground around the ring was bare dirt. Even so, we kept a careful eye on it. When the fire burned down, we kicked dirt over it and climbed up with the cooler. The cooler had Cooch's uncle's beer in it, and the leftover hot dogs and the rest of the chips. Up on the catwalk, the heat was different. Not cooler, but more open, with a little breeze moving up, which we had not been feeling down in the trees. We laid out the bags and sat against the tank. We talked and watched the town. The streetlights were on and half the houses set dark. You could tell, even from out there, that everyone in town was probably sleeping on top of their covers, trying to sleep. We drank, as Cooch told us, that he had heard the tower could go dry if the drought held. Then we'd all be hauling water from the county. And Brian soon brought up Aaron. But for a change, nobody wanted to get into the Aaron stuff tonight. So the talk moved on. I remember thinking I'd been an idiot to be so scared of this place, that I was so glad I came out. It was getting on toward 1 a.m. when the bugs quit. We were up high, away from the trees, so it took me a second to place what had changed. The clearing had gone quiet underneath us. All night there had been the wall of sound coming up out of the woods, the bugs and the frogs from the low spot off past the trees, and it had dropped out, but not everywhere, just down below us, around the base, that same moving pocket of quiet I'd walked through the summer before. My body knew it before my mind did. I sat up, knowing something was wrong, but not sure what it was yet. Brian asked if I was okay. I told him to be quiet. Something in the way I said that shut all 3 of them up. The 4 of us sat there and listened to the woods being silent right under us, but carrying on like normal just a little ways off. I went over to the rail and looked down, and there was nothing to see. Just a clearing, the dirt, and a black ring of trees around it, the path going off into the tract where we had come. The mag light was down in the cooler. I did not get it out. Some part of me did not want to put a light down there, just to find out if I was right. I did not want to be right. Cooch came over and looked too. He said he didn't see anything and wondered what my problem was. I tried to tell them. I said that there was something down there. I said I'd seen it last summer before, that they were wrong, that it wasn't a deer or a hobo, that the story I had told them was the whole and true story. It came out of me in a rush, and it sounded every bit as crazy as I knew it would, and I watched them not believe me. Cooch already grinning, getting ready to give me the business. Cooch grabbed the mag light out of the cooler himself to prove me wrong. He leaned out over the rail with it and swept the light around the clearing. Nothing but dirt and trees and path. I know he was about to say something smart, but then the beam went across the tree line on the far side, and one of the trunks down there looked wrong. It's hard to explain. It was a trunk, the same color as the others, the same rough bark. But it was a foot or so too wide for the trees around it, and it had no branches, and while the light was on it, it did not move at all. Not a leaf, not a sway. Cooch held the light on it, and we all stared at this trunk. Then, whatever scrap of moon there was went behind something, and the mag light stuttered, which wasn't paranormal, it was just something it had been doing all night. The batteries must have been worn down, and in the half-second the beam jumped, that trunk disappeared. There was now a gap between two real trees where that trunk had been. Nobody gave me the business after that. Cooch kept the light pointed at the gap, and his hand was far from steady. Brian asked, real quiet, what that was, and I said I didn't know. Denny began to say he wanted to go home over and over, like a kid much younger than he was. I looked down that ladder, the one ladder, running down the leg of the tower into the dark, ending right about where the tree line started, right about where that wrong trunk had been standing. I realized the spot we were in. To get down and out, we had to climb into that clearing and cross it, then go down the path through the trees. We had to go to the ground, and the ground was where it was. The next while was long. The heat did not let up. If anything, it got worse, probably radiating off the steel tank. The water inside that tank, if there was any at this point, was doing nothing to keep the heat at bay. We were all sweating out there, and we had nothing left to drink but warm beer. The worst thing you can put in a body that needs water. We were all getting very, very thirsty. Somewhere in there it came to me, sitting up on that catwalk, parched, with that thing standing guard at the bottom, the only way we could go down. What came to me was exactly how Aaron Pruitt had died. He had not been on anything. He had been right where we were. He'd gone up, then he could not make himself come back down, because coming down meant going to the ground, where it was. So he had stayed up here and waited for it to leave, and it never did. The heat and the thirst, it finished him while he stayed put. The creature, it never had to touch him. It need only wait. It was waiting on us the same way, and it had all the time in the world. And all we had left was a six-pack and the dark. I prayed our bodies would hold, or someone would find us. We didn't talk much. There was nothing to say that helped. Every few minutes one of us would crawl to the rail and look over, to see if it was still there. And it was always still there. A darker patch in the dark at the edge of the clearing, not moving. We would crawl back after seeing it, It had so much patience. It didn't pace back and forth or try to track us. It simply stood there, like it had nothing to do. The town sat out past the trees with all its lights, a couple of miles off, people sleeping in their beds, and it might as well have been on the moon. I kept thinking that if I yelled, really yelled as loud as I could, someone out there might hear me. I knew it was just a child's thought, but I kept thinking about it anyway. Cooch was the first one who broke. I didn't think it would be him, if I had to guess. He was the biggest of us, and the loudest, the last one you would figure to lose his head. But I think that was the trouble. He wasn't built to sit still, or to be afraid. The longer we sat, the worse he got, jiggling his leg, swearing under his breath, and telling us this was all so stupid. We couldn't sit up here all night. The thing was probably gone by now. He hadn't seen it move in 20 minutes, and so on. Before anyone understood what he was doing, he was up and over to the ladder. His foot was on the top rung, and he was starting to go down. I went after him. I had my hands in the back of his shirt, and Brian had him by the arm, and we were both yelling at him to stop, trying to haul him back up without going over the rail ourselves, and Cooch was fighting us. Halfway down the ladder now, his feet feeling for the next rung, his face turned up at us, furious and terrified at the same time. Down below him, at the bottom of the ladder, the darkness moved. We all saw it. The thing came away from the tree line and crossed the clearing toward the foot of the ladder, quickly yet quietly, lining itself up under Cooch, waiting for him to come to it. That's when we got our best look at it. Brian still had the maglite in the hand that wasn't holding on to Cooch, pointing it downward, and for just a moment, it lit up the thing at the bottom of the ladder, close to clear, closer than anybody should have ever seen a thing like that. It was tall. Standing straight, it would have been 1.5 feet over any man I've ever known. And it was thin, horribly sickly thin, like a man made of Play-Doh pulled tight. Its skin, where the light was hitting it, it was bark. I don't mean it was wearing bark, I mean its skin was like the bark of a tree, the same texture, ridged and split and dry, the same as the trunk it had been pretending to be. Like it had been built to stand against a tree and let you walk right past it, never the wiser. It had a head, and I can't tell you one thing about its face. The light was on it for a second, but I've never gotten that second back out of my head. I'm not sure where the strength came from, but we got him. Brian dropped the light and put both hands on Cooch, and we hauled him up that ladder backward, that thing right under his feet. The three of us went down in a pile on the catwalk. Cooch was making a sound I'd never heard a person make before, a high, thin whine, and his pants were wet. He didn't care, and not one of us said a word. The maglite had fallen and lay on the catwalk pointed straight up, throwing a useless beam at the sky. Down below, the thing had stopped at the foot of the ladder. It didn't try to climb it, and I wondered if it even could. It stood at the bottom, its head angled up at us. At least I knew it wasn't going to come up here. No, it just wanted to wait. Sitting there, pulled back from the rail with my heart slamming, I thought of something about the summer before that turned my stomach. All those times in the woods when I'd swung the flashlight around and caught nothing, just trees. That thing had been right there in front of my face, in the light, only feet away, standing by a trunk, being a trunk, while I stared straight at it and never even knew. It had never once lost me out there. It had been that close to me the entire walk out, close enough to put a hand or claw on me, and it let me go. Why? I've never found out why. I'd spent all this time grateful that I got lucky, but I don't think I got lucky. I think we'd been interrupted, before it was ready. Ready for whatever it does. After the near loss of Cooch, nobody went near the ladder again. We pulled back from the rail and sat against the tank as far from the edge as we could get. The four of us jammed together like little kids, and we waited. My God, I've never been that thirsty in my life. My tongue felt too big for my mouth. Cooch had gone quiet and just shook. Brian kept whispering that somebody would come. His dad would come. Somebody. The rest of us were pessimistic. I believed nobody would. We'd been too careful this time with the cover stories. Not one parent in that town had any idea where we were, and we had made sure of it. This time, no dad with his headlights would come driving up. That thought really hollowed me out up there. The summer before, the thing that pulled me out of those woods was an accident. My dad showing up furious at the worst possible minute and saving my life. There was not going to be an accident like that twice. We were going to sit up on that catwalk until the sun came up, hoping that it would be gone by then. Or would our bodies quit? The same as Aaron. I started trying to figure out how long until the sun came up. It had to be 2, maybe 2:30. The sky off to the east was not doing anything yet. The first light would be hours away, and full sun a while after that. Even then, I didn't know what good it would do us. That thing had come out into the open clearing plain as day to grab at Cooch. Maybe it didn't care about the light at all. Maybe it only cared about the trees. None of us knew. That was part of the torture. Sitting there, splitting the last of the warm beer, being baked alive despite the lack of a sun. Does it eat people? And would it eat human jerky? Because that's what we were slowly becoming. Something came out of the dark then. The dumbest, most ordinary and random thing in the world. We heard them before we saw them. Dogs. The dog pack. The one that had been the talk of the town all summer. The chickens and Petey's leg. They were coming through the tract from the low side. The whole pack of them, crashing through the brush, yipping and baying. The noisiest crap I'd heard all night. They came pouring into the clearing at the base of the tower, with their noses down. I thought about why they were coming our direction, and if I had to guess, to this day I'd tell you the hot dogs. We had cooked meat in that clearing at dusk, and the smell had sat in the dead still air, and the leftovers were still up here in the cooler with us. A pack of half-starved dogs roaming a burnt-up county in the middle of the night. They followed their noses straight to where the food was. Oh, and that thing at the bottom of the ladder. It didn't like those dogs at all. The pack didn't even know it was there. They weren't after it. They came in after the smell of the meat and ran right past where it stood. That tall, bark-covered thing came unstuck from the foot of the ladder and went fast, back into the tree line and away through the woods. 2 or 3 of the dogs caught the movement, and they tore off after it, barking. The rest of them stayed in the clearing under us, nosing the ground, occasionally glancing up at us. For the first time in what had felt like the whole night, the thing was not at the bottom of the ladder. However, we now had a different problem down there, which was almost a dozen feral dogs that had put a kid in stitches that summer. That was a problem that didn't feel Lovecraftian, and it was one we had an answer to. My dad had given me that answer 5 times, remember? You don't run, and you throw 'em some food. That's when you slowly get away. I told the others the plan. I grabbed the cooler. We went down that ladder fast, faster than was safe. Cooch first, now that he had a reason to move, and the thing was no longer down there. The dogs came at us in the clearing, all teeth and all noise, and I dug carefully while standing on the ladder, the hot dogs and the chips out of that cooler, and I threw all of it as far as I could across the clearing, away from our path. The dogs went for it, every last one of them. A pack of starving dogs will take a fistful of hot dogs over 4 stringy kids every time, and they swarmed that food. so we went the other way. Around the edge of the clearing, onto the path, and we went into the trees. Now we just had to walk that path, the same path, through the trees in the dark, without any light at all. The mag light was still up on the catwalk, pointing at the sky where Brian had dropped it. That was the longest 10 minutes of my life. The four of us holding on to the backs of each other's shirt in a line. We moved as fast as we could without breaking into a run, listening for any sign of it, and listening for those dogs. Every outline of a trunk we could even make out could be the thing that might come unstuck and step out towards us. But it had gone the other way, right? Off after whatever the dogs had chased it into. Or it had simply gone. It had left us alone. We came out at the fence line, and we got on our bikes. We rode back into town standing on those pedals the whole way. We were pedaling too hard and too fast to speak. We only slowed down when we were under the streetlights. We never told anyone the story, because for one, if our parents found out we went back to the watchtower, well, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Again. Plus, there's no way to tell a story like this without people thinking you're a bit loopy. If someone heard it, the whole thing, they would immediately assume we drank too much, got too hot, then got scared in a very weird way by a pack of wild dogs. And we didn't even have any proof. I mean, we had Cooch's wet pants, but for the sake of his honor, we kept that to ourselves too. The four of us were never quite the same after that night. We stayed friends, of course. It's not one of those friendship-ruining experiences. But we did stop going out to the tower, and we never went back to the tract, neither as a group nor as individuals. And the story about Aaron, the legends and all the rumors and the theories, those were finally laid to rest. You should know that the summer Aaron Pruitt died, it was the last real drought the town had before the one we experienced. The hottest, driest one anyone could remember, right up until ours came along and beat it. I didn't put two and two together until I was a grown man, reading about old droughts in some history book, and when I made the realization, I sat straight up in my chair. I don't know what that thing is. I don't know where it goes in the wet years and the cold ones, but I would hazard a guess. It comes back when the creek runs low, when the corn curls up, and the heat won't quit. I've wondered ever since how many dry summers that little town has buried a kid and blamed it on something else entirely. I've heard of monsters that come in the rain, the fog, blizzards, hurricanes, and even tornadoes. Y'all remember the tornado wolves, right? But I swear, this might be the first time I've heard of a creature who awakens in a drought. So that's creepy. And now me being thirsty after a long recording session is a little creepier than it should be. Good night, and go drink some water. Thank you all for listening to this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. If you have an experience with the unexplained, I would love to hear it. Send it to me over at darkstories.org so I can narrate it on the show in the future. Support us and help us become a bit more independent by going to erie.fm/premium and signing up for premium membership. You'll get ad-free access to these episodes, bonus stories, audiobooks, and more. That's erie.fm/premium. Thank you. Till next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Every town has that story of the kid who went too far. That kid is either in prison, dead, or has simply never been the same. Such is life. But in this story from Lay B, we learn there is an alternate and possibly more terrifying fate For that kid who thinks rules are for goobers, and that fate would be encountering disturbing beings that should not exist. Lei B warns us with her story to beware and respect the moon-eyed people of the Blue Ridge Mountains. This is a tale from the break room. I grew up at the base of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a sub-range of the Appalachians in the Piedmont region of North Carolina. The folklore and legends from my state always fascinated me as a kid, and my family begrudgingly tolerated my exploration of the subject. We took evening drives up the parkway to see the Brown Mountain Lights. We once drove to Bear Creek, North Carolina, to see the infamous Devil's Stomping Ground. On a trip to the Outer Banks, we made a point to visit Topsoil Island, where the Gray Lady is meant to pace the beach. The older I got, the more history intertwined with the folklore and legends from my state, and these connections always piqued my interest. In my teens, I explored cemeteries where Civil War soldiers were buried, and I navigated revolutionary battlefields with alleged sightings and hauntings. I went to a university in the South, majoring in history and folklore, graduating with honors. I paid to take courses in cemetery iconography and preservation. I volunteered with my local historical society. I did these things to understand the history of my home, but also hoped that maybe one day I would find proof that the folklore rang true, that there was something special about the legends in North Carolina which had survived through oral tradition for decades, passed down through generations of North Carolinians. It's no surprise that my career path took me into similar realms. I am a cultural heritage public historian, meaning I work for museums and sites of public history throughout North and South Carolina. My specialty is oral history. I basically supplement artifacts in museums with stories from ordinary Carolinians who choose to tell me about their lives. These stories become archived interviews, which are held in archival repositories in perpetuity. Through oral history and public history work, I've managed to turn my interest in social and local history into a career, and I've met some of the most fascinating and interesting people along the way. Ethel was one of those people that I will never forget. I first met Ethel in the fall of 2015. Museum staff were doing research for an exhibit on sharecropping, and a family friend suggested I interview her. If she agreed, of course. Sharecropping, for those unfamiliar, was an exploitative system suffered by poor farmers, both white and black, in the period after the American Civil War. Landlords contracted out land in return for a portion of the crop yield, hence the name sharecropping. The majority of sharecroppers across the South were poor white families, and it was one of the only ways for farmers to earn a living prior to the Second World War, if they didn't own any land. It was an unpredictable way of life. Sharecropping forced families to farm cash crops like tobacco and cotton for the highest yields, but also left them reliant on good growing conditions and at the mercy of the landowner. Life was so difficult under these conditions that farm families relied on the labor of their own children for help, and the children began performing chores and tasks around the farm as early as 4 or 5. Ethel was pushing 93 when I contacted her for an interview, but despite her age, she was sharp as a tack. I made the initial contact with her through a telephone call, where I explained what a life history interview was, and where I laid out the benefits of recording her oral history. She seemed wary, not of the practice of recording her story, but of the value it might have. She didn't believe her life would make an interesting story. Oh, how she was wrong about that. With additional questions asked, and with me assuring her that her experience with sharecropping was useful to our exhibit, we decided on a date and time for the interview. Now, given her age and thinking of her comfort, I suggested recording the interview in her house, which was well into the mountain region of the state. I was thrilled when she agreed, because it meant I could take advantage of staying at my grandparents' mountain home, a vacation home they had purchased in my preteen years. The mountain house, as we called it, was a 3-bedroom cabin tucked into the Grandfather Mountain area of the Blue Ridge Mountains. You had to traverse a pretty steep road with no guardrails to make it up the hill and into the gravel driveway. The house itself was 2 stories with a full basement. The basement was mostly used for laundry and the storage of deck chairs, swings, and outdoor games and equipment. The second floor had floor-to-ceiling glass windows, which looked into an open, airy living room with a massive rock fireplace. The dining area and kitchen were both on the second floor as well, as the whole floor was open concept. At the foot of the stairs leading up to the second floor was the door leading to the wraparound porch. The second floor held 3 bedrooms, a bathroom, and 2 additional balconies, which overlooked the first floor wraparound porch. The house itself was built above a steep gully, maybe 20 feet deep. When my grandparents first bought the place, we all started to call this drop in the earth the gorge. As in, kids, stay well away from the edge of the gorge. The porch and second-story balconies overlooked the gorge, and we all enjoyed sitting outside and watching wildlife in and around it. As a family, we only visited the cabin during the spring, summer, and fall for get-togethers and Sunday lunch cookouts. Otherwise, the cabin offered a quiet weekend away for anyone who would find the time to make the drive. This was exactly what I hoped for the weekend I was set to interview Ethel. I planned to head to Ethel's house, interview her for a few hours, maybe do some work Friday afternoon, then spend Friday evening sipping wine on the porch of the house. Saturday, I would wander around the local museum and shops, maybe take a short hike to see some waterfalls in the area. Sunday morning, I would start down the mountain, making it home in time for Sunday lunch at my grandmother's. The following Friday, after my call with Ethel, I packed the car, eager to start the drive through the Blue Ridge Mountains. I threw an overnight bag into the back seat, along with my interview pack and a few bags of groceries, snacks, and wine. With the car loaded, I was off. I drove up the highway, snaking my way into the mountains of North Carolina, sunroof open to smell the sweet scent of rhododendron as I progressed upward. I tuned into a favorite local radio station, WNCW, and spent the journey listening to bluegrass and folk music of the mountain. I was in my element. The drive took almost 3 hours. During the last half hour or so, I lost cell service and my GPS signal, but I navigated the back roads with a paper map, arriving only 15 minutes late. When I finally pulled into Ethel's gravel drive, she was waiting for me on the porch in a weathered rocking chair, a faded knit cardigan covering her legs. "Hi there," I called after exiting the car and stretching my back. Ethel responded with a rock forward in her chair and an "mm-hmm" as she moved to stand up and walk into the house. "Come on inside," she called behind her. I noticed she was surprisingly limber for someone in their 90s. As I followed her in the house, I let the screen door slam behind me, and she motioned for me to sit before heading into the kitchen. "Y'all want some tea?" she asked from the other room. "No, ma'am, I'm okay with water for the interview," I replied, as I began unpacking my interview bag. I was setting up the recorder and the external mic, checking the batteries and volume, when she sauntered back to the sitting room with a glass of cold sweet tea in one hand and a water in the other. She sat in a worn cloth chair which engulfed her large frame. "So," she said, staring at me intently, "you're here to listen to me blather about growing up on this here mountain." "Yes, ma'am," I said. "That's exactly right, and specifically what it was like to sharecrop as a family in the 1930s. She paused, continuing to look at me. "I've got to say, I'm really excited about this, Ethel," I added. "Your family worked the land a long time, and I think your story is important to capture." She took a long sip of her tea. All right then, she sighed. What you want to know? Ethel had amazing insight into the topic. She talked about the family farm. They were sharecrop farmers, as most folk in Appalachia were in those days. She picked cotton from the age of 5, tending the hogs and chicken with her 7 brothers and sisters. She told me about her responsibilities, the things she did with the little bit of leisure time they were given. She told me how she helped make the children's clothing from old feed sacks, and how she and her sisters made dolls out of sticks and twine. And she told me about her father, who helped 2 other local men make moonshine deep in the holler beyond her house. Her favorite time of year was Christmas, the only time the children got oranges, some nuts, and a bit of chocolate as Christmas gifts. I was fascinated by her history growing up in the area, and would have happily kept listening for hours. In a lull between stories, I asked, did all the children have jobs on the farm? It must have been a bit easier with 7 of you sharing the work. Ethel paused for a minute, looking away from me, toward the door. As an oral historian, we're trained to let people sit with their thoughts, to not interrupt, so I waited for her. After a long pause, she reflected. Really, there were only 6 of us, not 7. You can't count Clyde. In fact, we never really talked about Clyde after the accident. I paused for a moment myself, waiting for Ethel to pick up the story, but she was silent. I wasn't surprised she had lost a sibling. Hell, it was surprising 6 of the 7 had made it past infancy, given the time period and the mortality rate in Appalachia. However, something in her silence put me on edge. I waited about 30 seconds before asking, Ethel, can you tell me about your brother Clyde? Ethel placed her glass of tea on the end table, not meeting my eye. She was staring down, avoiding eye contact with me. It's a shame, really. He just didn't believe Daddy, or maybe that day he just didn't want to listen. I don't know. But he stayed out after dark, and he never came back. Ethel's face depicted a mix of regret and sadness. The memory had cast a shadow over her, and really the entire room. However, this was the kind of memory that I'm trained to follow up on, although I think the key driving factor at this point was my own curiosity. Ethel, I said, I would really like to know more about Clyde, if you're all right talking about it. She looked at me hard, with a bit of judgment, I thought. You didn't grow up in these mountains. You don't know the legends. She said it curtly, and there was a subsequent pause between us. Nah, not just the legends, she said, but the rules of what folks can and can't do. The rules that keep the balance and the harmony and keep folks safe. I was a little self-conscious, because as much as I felt I was an insider into this community, clearly she didn't see me like that. So I acknowledged her observation and asked, can you tell me about the legends and about these rules? This wasn't what I'd come for. I was supposed to find out about her childhood and about sharecropping, about her life beyond the farm. But I couldn't help but follow up on this question, my own curiosity and intrigue guiding me. Listen, child, there are rules to these mountains. You don't pay mind to things, you hear? If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. You just keep walking and you keep ignoring it, and you never run, and you never look back. Clyde knew that. We all knew that. But when you're a youngin', when you're just a boy, you don't know no better. Clyde was just a boy, really. He stayed out too long and the moon-faced people knowed it. I suddenly realized how cold and uncomfortable I felt. It was like a cold snap had engulfed the room. I had chills and suddenly felt completely underdressed for a visit to an old lady's living room. The moon-faced people? That was a new one. I racked my brain for a connection to local folklore and legend, but I had nothing. I had no idea what she was talking about. She saw it in my face, though. I must have looked confused, like I was trying to place something that I had no connection to. She countered my confusion with an explanation, possibly in the same language her mother and father used with her and the other children. Yes, the moon-faced people. They were here well before us. The Cherokee have legends. They're only about at night with their big eyes and little bodies. They hide in the caves during the day, and they don't take no disrespect. If you stay out at night and they find you, you ain't coming back. She sat further back in her chair, reaching for her glass of tea. And you think they had something to do with Clyde disappearing? I asked cautiously. Well, of course they did, she quipped. Clyde was only about 10. He would go and play with the Simon boys 3 farms over when they had some time, but he had to cross the creek down the bottom of the holler, and he knew he had to start back home before the sun went down. Me and my younger sisters were too little to venture that far, and you know how it was. Boys were men when they was born, let to do anything. So me and my sisters would stay behind. We'd build fairy houses out of moss and stones, and we played in the yard till Mama called us in for supper, or until Clyde got back. But that night, it was sometime in the fall, before the cold snaps at night, and that night, Clyde didn't come back for supper. Daddy waited a while before he set out with our old dog and his shotgun, and I remember thinking, that gun ain't no good. The moon-faced people got him now, and he ain't coming back. Ethel looked defeated, but she sighed and sat up a little straighter, with a "what can you do" type of expression on her face. So he never turned up? Your father didn't find anything? I asked. Nope. The Simon boys said he'd left their farm that night. Later than usual, mind, but not that late. Daddy looked all through the woods, and some local folks joined in as well, but for 3 days, they didn't find nothing. Then, they found his body, floating in one of the creek pools. Said he'd drowned. Maybe he slipped and fell in trying to get home, but I knowed better. Clyde was tough. He knew these mountains. He could swim better than any of us. It was the moon-faced people. Maybe he didn't follow the rules. Might have tried to run. Maybe he took a shortcut somewhere he ain't ought to be. Maybe you tried to talk to him. That's all it takes, you know. And do you know, none of us kids ventured off the farm for the next year at least. Mama's rules. Only Daddy went up to the still with the old dog. We was careful and we let them know that's their territory, and we ain't up to trespassing it. Ethel and I had been talking for hours at this point, and she seemed tired. She finished her tea, and after a long swallow, she said, "We didn't talk about Clyde after that year. It wasn't 'cause we didn't miss him. We was busy, you know. Daddy had lost him a farmhand, and us girls had to start doing more of the farm work. It was a hard year. But soon enough, my 3 youngest brothers came along, and we just moved on with life. Wasn't much else to do back then." That seemed to be the end of the story for Ethel, almost like she wasn't willing to discuss it further or to take more questions on the subject. I knew it was time for me to leave. I looked for a way to start wrapping things up, thanking her for her time and telling her I'd let her get back to her evening. I packed my bag with the recorder and microphone, taking the glasses back to the kitchen for her. She stood up to walk me to the door, but didn't come out onto the porch, stopping at the screen door instead. I turned around on her porch steps to tell her thank you again, but she wasn't looking at me. She was looking into the woods around her house. Our farm was just through them there trees, about half an hour's walk. I ain't never walked down to where they found Clyde, but it ain't far. That creek runs down from Tennessee and through the whole county and more. There's crags and caves in some of the gullies too. Best not to disturb any of those, 'cause that's where they hide during the day. With that, her attention snapped back to me, and she looked up to the sky. Time you get on down the road. Shouldn't be talking about them no more. It'll be pure dark soon. I pulled my glance away from the woods, curious about the farm she'd spent the afternoon talking about. I let her know. Oh, it's no problem, Ethel. I'm just heading down the road a bit to my grandparents' cabin for the night. I don't have very far to go, actually. Nothing like the trek up the mountain anyway. But you have a great night. I'll be in touch about the exhibit progress. I was walking toward my car when she asked, Where's your folks' place? Oh, we're just over Linville Way. I'll be there for the weekend, then I'll be heading back down the mountain on Sunday. Her eyebrows furrowed for a moment, but then she gave me a wave and said, All right then. She turned to go back into her house, pausing with her back to the screen door. Just be careful if you're staying round here, she said over her shoulder. Remember what I was telling about the rules and all that? And with that word of warning, she walked into the house, closing the front door behind her. I thought about Ethel's story during the drive over to the cabin. Not so much the sharecropping bit, but the beliefs passed down through what was bound to be generations of mountain folk. Beliefs so real to them that they were used to explain a child's death and keep the other kids at home for a year. And what in the hell were moon-faced people? I was buzzing with excitement when I finally made it to the cabin. I put away my overnight bag and unloaded the groceries in the kitchen cabinets and fridge. I settled in on the couch with a glass of wine and a poor excuse for a charcuterie board, cobbled together from things I'd brought up the mountain, and a block of cheese purchased on a roadside stand I'd passed coming into town. Between bites of cheese and crackers, I was researching moon-faced people in Appalachia, absorbing anything I could about these entities fresh on my radar. The creatures Ethel called moon-faced people were actually the moon-eyed people, an ancient Cherokee legend. Creatures with short, small bodies, white skin, and perhaps blue eyes, but noticeably flat faces with large hollows around the eyes. Some say they're a Native American interpretation of seeing European settlers for the first time, but other sources put the moon-eyed people in the region well before the Cherokee made it their home. They're said to reside in caves during the day because of their light skin, only emerging at night, navigating by the light of the moon. Even more interesting to me was the statue that was unearthed in the 1840s of moon-eyed people. It was found in Butler, North Carolina, on what would have marked a prominent road during the Trail of Tears, when Native Americans were displaced from their homelands and forced to relocate to the west, often on foot. More archaeological evidence supposedly sits in Georgia, at Fort Mountain State Park, where an erected stone wall is attributed to the moon-eyed people, built as protection from the Cherokee. I stayed glued to my computer for another hour, reading everything I could find, although most sites and stories just corroborated each other. Cherokee legend, small people, possibly blue eyes, but definitely round hollow eye areas. Only come out at night due to light sensitivity and live in caves. One thing that did baffle me was the locality of these stories. They spanned the westernmost portions of North Carolina, around Cherokee County, into Georgia and Tennessee. Ethel's family resided hours from this area, and that was with modern roads. The legend had obviously traveled throughout the mountain region by word of mouth. My research was interrupted after about an hour by a phone call from my mother. "Hi, honey. How did the interview go?" I grabbed my cigarettes and lighter and an old heavy coat hanging by the door before heading out to the porch to speak to her. "It went really well. Fascinating, even," I said, as I plopped into one of the rocking chairs, overlooking the steep gorge behind the house. "The sharecropping stories will be perfect for the exhibit, and I've asked her to see if she can find old photos to better represent the family. You know, give a face to the voice telling the story. That kind of thing. She's gonna get back to me on that next week." Mom seemed pleased it went well, and started to change the subject to discussions around what we would make for Sunday lunch, when I stopped her. "Mom, there's one more thing, though. The end of the interview was, well, I don't know. Maybe spooky is the right word." "What do you mean?" she asked. I took a long drag from my cigarette, then launched into the story Ethel had told about her brother Clyde and the moon-faced people. I told her about the harmony that supposedly existed between folks on the mountain and these entities, about Ethel's warnings and about the rules. I then explained what I'd found in the few hours of research I was able to do before she called. "I mean, there are actual statues, Mom. I even thought about driving out to the museum in Butler tomorrow to see this thing in real life. Can you imagine uncovering such an artifact in your own backyard, knowing it was left behind during one of the most horrific events of ethnic cleansing in American history? It's just wild." "Well," my mother didn't seem to know exactly how to respond to all this. "She couldn't have told her story to a more interested party, I'll give you that. But you know, Leigh, you're up there by yourself this weekend. Maybe you should shelf any other research until you're back home. I don't want you winding yourself up. Besides, you know how mountain folk can be. It's all superstition built around teaching kids lessons. These moon people, or whatever they're called. It's just a way to warn their kids to be home on time, not to stay out after dark, advise against entering caves, those sorts of things." I was a little annoyed at her reaction. She knew I was passionate about any folklore-related topics, yet it felt like I was being brushed off. I finished my cigarette and pulled my jacket closer. The wind was starting to blow colder through the trees. "Right, well, I'm gonna head inside now and finish my glass of wine. Might just call it an early night. Besides, the wind is picking up and I'm freezing out on this porch." She sighed. "All right." She could tell I was annoyed with her response. "Well, have a good night and I'll speak to you later. Make sure you wake up in time that you're not late for Sunday lunch, too." "Got it, Mom. I'll see you soon." I hung up the phone in a huff. Despite the cold, I wasn't really ready to go inside yet. I stood up, lighting another cigarette and walking over to the balcony edge. The gorge below was steep, but the house was built to make use of its depth and natural beauty. When they first bought the house, we were all scared of falling off the balcony and into that gully, and the adults took extra measures to make sure the smaller kids did not go near the edge. It wasn't terribly deep, though. You could see the bottom, covered in limbs and leaves, and my cousins and I used to vow we were going to find the other side one day. The opening couldn't be far, and we were sure it led to caves and curiosities, but we never attempted to find it. Without thinking, I looked down and yelled aloud, "Hello!" into the gorge. It was too windy to hear much of an echo. I yelled again, "Hello!" But all I heard were trees rustling in the wind. I closed my eyes, listening to the sound of the forest, enjoying the cold against my face. I finished my cigarette while leaning against the porch railing, looking up at the sky. It was a dark night, too cloudy to see stars. I turned back to the gorge momentarily, ready to get inside, into the warmth, when something caught my eye. I paused and tried to concentrate my stare on the pale thing at the bottom of the gorge. It was roundish, with an almost iridescent coloring. It wasn't bright, just pale. And moving? Was it moving? The thing was shifting itself as if it were walking. At times I could make out the roundish head. Then it would disappear into the side of the gorge nearest me, blocking it from view. I stood there another 2 minutes, watching it saunter along at the bottom of the gorge. It was so dark, I could only make out its movements from the pale, hazy light it cast. It wasn't moving fast, and at first it reminded me of a deer sauntering through the forest, stopping to nibble at grass, in no hurry to move on. Just as that thought entered my mind, just as I thought, there's no way this can be a deer, the figure disappeared into the left side of the embankment, and it was gone. I waited another few minutes, but I saw nothing. I was suddenly so cold, chilled from the wind, but also by this thing. This dull moving light at the bottom of a gorge that was, from my understanding, inaccessible for miles. Maybe my mom had a point, and I had just creeped myself out. That, coupled with staying alone in the cabin, probably caused me to see something that wasn't actually there. With a shiver, I grabbed my cigarettes and moved to walk inside the cabin, giving one last glance to the gorge, but seeing nothing but darkness. I decided to put away my laptop for the night. Turning on the TV for a distraction, I settled onto the couch with a blanket and a glass of wine. I found a romantic comedy I'd seen about a dozen times and tried to let it distract me from my thoughts of those moon-eyed people, and from whatever I just saw. My mind raced through the possibility that I'd just seen some sort of animal, that maybe it wasn't as cloudy as I'd thought. Maybe the moonlight managed to illuminate portions of the gorge, and that's what I equated to its movement. But none of the explanations made sense. After my third glass of wine, and with lower inhibitions, I decided to heck with this. I should be able to go back out onto the porch and have a cigarette. Moon-eyed people be damned. Once again, I grabbed the heavy coat from the rack, stuck my cigarettes and lighter into the pocket, and opened the porch door. It was quieter now. The wind had died down a bit, and I could hear the sounds of the forest around me. I settled into my rocking chair, deliberately looking away from the gorge. I lit my cigarette and began rocking, my eyes fixed on the opposite side of the porch, toward my parked car. The squeak of the rocking chair was calming as I rocked back and forth, lulling myself into a sense of calm where I was safe. Where I was in the mountains surrounded by forest and scents of fresh fauna, at my family's favorite place. I was remembering a particularly fond family cookout on that very porch when I heard it. Someone somewhere said my name.
Nay.
My whole body tensed as I abruptly stopped rocking. I sat completely still, letting my cigarette burn as I listened closely. I heard it again, quietly, almost like a whisper. I heard a pleading voice call, "Lay." My one-syllable name was elongated to 3 or 4 seconds. Its tone begged me to respond, almost as though it were in pain, almost as though it needed my help. I felt my heart beating hard in my chest. My body was tense as I sat as still and as quiet as possible. I sat this way for minutes without hearing a sound outside of the rustle of wind in the trees. It was long enough that I started disputing with myself that I'd heard anything at all. Maybe it was just the wind. Wasn't that what people always said when they heard sounds in the woods while alone? The tension had subsided with the passing time, and I could feel my body giving up its rigidity of the last 5 minutes when I heard the name again. This time it was fast and angry, and it was louder. Lay. It seemed to be coming from all sides of the gorge. I couldn't place it as I hurriedly stood up, knocking over the side table next to me. I hesitantly looked over the balcony for the source of the sound, or for the pale light, for anything that might explain what I'd heard and seen this evening. Soon, I saw it, straight across from me. Not in the gorge any longer, but on the opposite side, directly across from me. It was pale with a round face and hollows for eyes. It was a short humanoid form, slight in build, but I could make out the legs and arms for the first time. I froze. Maybe it was the wine, but I felt as though I could not move, like my brain was trying to register what it was seeing. I was staring at this thing, trying to make sense of what it could be. But then it started to move. It was walking, slowly, parallel to the porch, with just the opening of the gorge between us. A rush of panic flooded my senses, and I opened my mouth to scream. I almost choked on the sound, trying to escape my lungs, when a dawning recognition struck. I remembered Ethel's warning. I remembered the rules. And I remembered what happened when Clyde didn't follow them. You don't pay mind to things, you hear? If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. You just keep walking, and you ignore it, and you never run, and you never look back. My thoughts were flooded with the realization that I'd spoken about the moon-eyed people aloud, on the porch, to my mother. I shared the deep Appalachian folklore passed down quietly through families for generations. I went so far as to question their existence on that call, to share I was doing research in an effort to understand where this myth, this folklore, originated. I spoke about artifacts being found and historical connections throughout the region. My mind recalled all the talking points. What exactly had I said? Did I do something to draw them to me? The gorge would be the perfect place for them. Dark and cavernous, with so little access from the outside world, so little reach for the sun's rays. I was still staring at the figure as it continued to walk, its pale form navigating the ridge slowly and deliberately. Its pale face was turned toward me as it walked, with little attention to the forest floor. Outwardly, I was shaking. I'd crossed my arms, hugging my torso for comfort. I felt sick. My mind was racing, but I managed to pull my thoughts together to try to be practical. Right, I thought. I didn't actually see it, and I didn't actually hear anything. I'll turn around, walk back into the cabin, and just lock up for the night. I'll pull the blinds and barricade myself in the master bedroom. All I need is the morning light. All I need is to wait it out until morning. As it continued to walk slowly along the ridge, I turned away, pulling my gaze from the creature. I began to calmly walk inside. I locked the porch door behind me, lowering the small blind on the door's glass. I went into the living room, with its high ceilings and tall windows built for the morning sunlight. The room felt unsafe now, with clear views of the road leading to the cabin. I turned off the TV, pulling the curtains on the first-floor windows, the only curtains available to close. I continued this throughout the first floor, closing the kitchen blinds, the ones in the small dining room. I left the light on, and all the lamps. Then I made my way to the master bedroom on the second floor. The master had a small balcony overlooking the gorge as well. In fact, all the bedrooms overlooked the gorge, facing the back of the house. I locked myself inside the room, then made sure the door to the balcony was locked. I pulled the curtains tight against the balcony door and sat on the bed, my heart pounding. But my adrenaline was starting to wane. It was approaching midnight at this point, and having drank a bottle of wine with cheese and crackers for supper, my eyes were growing heavy regardless of my pounding heart. I did not want to fall asleep, even though I was exhausted. I quickly turned on all 3 lamps in the room for more light, hoping that this would deter anything from trying to come into the house. The moon-eyed people couldn't stand light, so surely I was safe in a lamp-lit bedroom. I crawled under my covers, my phone in hand in case of an emergency, and I waited. For half an hour, nothing happened. No calls of my name or even loud whistling of the wind. Eventually, my exhaustion won out, and I fell asleep at some point. The bedside alarm clock read 3:22 when I awoke in the dark. I was confused as to where I was for a moment, looking around the dark bedroom for something familiar. Then the situation rushed back to me, and I sat straight up. All 3 lights, my beacons of hope and saving grace, had been switched off. Was it a power cut? It couldn't be. The alarm clock still worked. Then I noticed the light of the moon. It was pouring in through the glass balcony doors. The clouds must have dissipated at some point in the night. I scrambled to the left side of the bed, as far away from the balcony doors I could get, looking in terror as the moonlight streamed in. The electricity is one thing, but I distinctly remembered closing the curtains. They were my protection against seeing the moon-eyed people again, against seeing the gorge at all. I began to shake with panic. My phone lay on the bed, feet away from me. But who would I call? What would I even tell someone if I called? I was being targeted by what? A Cherokee legend? I tried the bedside lamp. The switch clicked on and off, but no light. If the electricity was out, maybe my phone had enough battery to provide some light. If I could grab my phone and turn on the flashlight, I could potentially dash to the balcony, close the curtains again, and check the lock on the bedroom door. Then it was only 2.5 hours until sunrise. I was sure I could stay alert for 2.5 hours. I crawled along the bed to grab my phone, then quickly ambled to the left side, as far away from the balcony as possible. 30% battery. A relief flooded over me. I switched it on and left it face down on the side table, illuminating most of the room. I took a few deep breaths, trying to muster the courage to run to the balcony door. I waited a few minutes, listening intently and hearing nothing before I finally convinced myself to move. In a mad dash, I jumped off the bed, running to the balcony door to pull the curtains. I got the right curtain closed, and I went to grab the left, when that pale light caught my eye again. It was below me, standing next to the rocking chair I'd left just a few hours ago. The moon-eyed thing. I could see it now a little better. Still a humanoid figure with distinct arms and legs. It was just a body though, no clothing, but small in stature, maybe 3.5 feet high. Its whole body was glowing pale, but its face was so wrong. It was very round with no discernible mouth. The most striking feature were those hollow eyes, almost gape-like, and I couldn't see anything but holes. It was standing adjacent to the porch door, beside the rocking chair, in the exact spot I'd stood while watching it walk parallel to the gorge, and now it was staring straight up at my balcony doors. It wasn't a full moon, and I only looked for a few seconds, but that image, that feeling of invasiveness, that it had invaded my property, my sense of safety, and that it knew which room I was currently in. That feeling will never leave me. I jerked the left side of the curtains closed and threw myself onto the bed, crying uncontrollably. How had it made it to my porch? That gully stretched throughout the valley, and I was unaware of where to even cross it. More so, what the hell had I done to draw these things to me? With that thought, I started to imagine what Clyde could have possibly done to anger these moon-eyed people. Had he seen the same thing I was seeing now? Clyde, whose story had brought us here, and Ethel, who shared a family legend, some mountain folklore, then me, who stupidly repeated it all out loud into the gorge. I stayed curled up against the top of the bed frame for what felt like an hour, with only the phone illuminating the room. Soon it would be morning, I kept telling myself. Soon this will all be over, and I can go home, and I will swear off this whole region. I would stay happily in the Piedmont, avoiding any cave or gorge or dark forest for the rest of my life, if I could only survive this night. I hugged my legs and cried. I cried until I eventually fell asleep, sometime after 4 a.m. I awoke to light streaming in through the balcony curtains. It was the soft sunlight of dawn, and the illumination around the curtain's edges was the most incredible sight of my life. My eyes were puffy and irritated from crying, but I got up off the bed and slowly opened the curtains. It was a gorgeous morning. The gorge and ridge surrounding the cabin were glowing with the morning sun, illuminating trees just beginning to turn to their autumnal reds and golds, and a slight dusting of frost on the ground below. I slowly peeled the curtains back and looked down at the porch. The rocking chair sat motionless, the side table still overturned. But other than that, it was just as I'd left it last night. There were no signs, or not that I could see from above, of the moon-eyed people. I fully opened the curtains, then tried the bedside lamp. It turned on at the click of the switch. So did the lamp in the corner, and the one on the desk. The electricity was working just fine. I sat down on the edge of the bed, confused, and with a bit of a headache. I remembered everything so vividly. I saw something in that gorge. It then reappeared out of the gorge, on the other side of the embankment, and it terrified me by coming onto my porch, standing exactly where I'd been when I first glimpsed it, staring up at me, up at my bedroom. All of it never felt like a dream, and I never doubted it. I had been more scared than I'd ever been in my life after seeing it, and that is not something you simply dream. It was that moment that I flew into action. I splashed some water on my face and began packing my toiletries. I'd hardly unpacked my overnight bag, but I changed into my leggings and a sweatshirt, throwing my pajamas into the bag. I grabbed my phone and its charger, and I took the stairs 2 by 2. As soon as I reached the landing, it hit me. It was incredibly bright in the living room. I glanced around and realized that every single curtain and blind that I'd closed were now completely open. The large windows in the living room were fully visible, streaming in the morning sunlight. The curtains I'd closed last night, the ones covering the ground floor glass, were open. The kitchen and dining room too. Even the small shade covering the porch door was pulled open. It was as though it was sending a sign that I hadn't been safe from them, and that the light was no obstacle at night. That same anxious adrenaline flooded me again as I set my bag on the couch. I tried the lamp in the living room. It worked, clicking on and off. My initial thoughts were validated. It wasn't electrical. There was no outage. This was something else. This was a targeted attack on the lamps in my bedroom that somehow stopped once it was light outside. This was a message meant to warn me, to show me that I had somehow trespassed or disrespected these people. I stood another few minutes just gazing around the room, thinking about the curtains, about the lights, when I decided it was time to get the heck out of this house. I grabbed the few groceries I had stored in the kitchen, shoving them into grocery bags. I left the wine glass and plate in the kitchen sink, not wanting to stay long enough to wash and put them away. I was at the front door in under 2 minutes, grabbing my keys as I reached for the handle. I turned the knob and opened it when I stopped. The door was unlocked, even the deadbolt, which I had absolutely locked when I came back from my interview with Ethel. My hands were shaking as I pulled open the door and bolted out. I locked both locks, taking the stairs 2 by 2 down to my car. It was 6:50 a.m. when I started my car and began reversing down the drive. There would be no museum visit for me, and I definitely would not be staying around long enough to visit the national park, quaint town, or the immensely popular attraction, the Linville Gorge. I was done with the Blue Ridge Mountains, and more of a believer than I'd ever been. I called Ethel the next week to follow up on our conversation. I thanked her again, noting how invaluable it would be to preserve her memory of mountain life. We exchanged pleasantries for as long as was comfortable, and I was ready to end that call and my ties to Ethel when she remarked, "Those stories about Clyde, those memories I tell to you, you can't use them for the museum." I wasn't surprised. Narrators often have objections to certain things shared in the heat of the moment. I assured her, "Oh no, Ethel, those stories aren't really relevant here. In fact, if you wanted me to remove them from the interview audio itself, I can do that. You can still archive your interview, but we won't include those portions, as they're quite personal to you." "Ain't because they're personal, eh?" I was surprised at how exasperated she seemed, and a little confused. "We can't be talking about them, that's all. I don't know if I should even tell you." "Right," I said. I knew exactly what she meant. I knew more than she could have ever imagined. I said uneasily, "By the way, Ethel, I had an experience at my grandparents' house after I left our interview." She was completely silent. "I was just wondering if you thought maybe—" She cut me off. "If you seen something, no you didn't. If you heard something, no you didn't. I hope to God you just kept walking and you ignored it, and that you didn't run, and you never looked back. That's all I'm gonna say on that. Some of us folks still have to live in these here hollers." I had nothing to say except, "Yes, ma'am." With that, our call ended, and I never ever spoke openly about the Moonite people again. My mom tried to follow up at Sunday lunch, asking why I'd ended my trip early and how the research was going. I let her know it was a bit of a disappointment, that I'd found nothing else, and it seemed it was just a legend after all. In fact, I announced I don't even think Ethel was speaking about the same folklore or legend I'd found. None of it added up, but that was all a lie. There was nothing to the stories at all, I lied. My family feigned interest for all of 20 minutes, but the topic was never broached again. As for that house, the mountain house, I didn't return for any family gatherings for the next 3 years. By 2018, my grandparents had decided to list it. While I was sad that part of my life would be gone, I was also relieved. I had an excuse to never step foot on that mountain again, and to never have to see that gorge. I moved to Scotland 6 years ago, and it's only now I feel comfortable sharing anything about this encounter. I'm still not sure what exactly those things were, because I stopped researching, and I stopped searching for answers. I amended the audio before giving it to the museum, so no one has ever heard Ethel's story, and I never spoke about it to anyone aside from my mom. I share this mostly to document a legend that I'd never heard of, but has now fundamentally shaped my life because I did not listen to the advice given to me. I also share it out of respect for the rules and the harmony that folks in the Appalachian Mountains have lived by for decades. I still love to read about North Carolina history, and I miss the beauty of the Blue Ridge Parkway in the fall. But thoughts of that region beyond that fill me with anxiety and dread. So, please, learn from my experience before careless actions leave you with the most traumatic experience of your life. Don't sweep folklore and legends under the rug of fiction. Often these stories linger because they serve an important purpose. Maybe it's to warn folks about staying out after dark or traveling dangerous paths. Sometimes, however, it's a reminder that we share this world with beings that wish to be left alone, lest you suffer a painful price. Good night. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Tales from the Break Room. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails. And if you want more of my scary story narrations, find my other show, Unexplained Encounters, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Also, you can send me your scary work stories at eeriecast.com/submit. Till next time, everyone, I'd better clock out. But I'll be clocking in again real soon. My God, get ready, because this story scared even me. It almost made me regret living in the Ozarks. This story is titled Box Fan and was sent to me by a viewer named simply Jeb. In it, he recalls a series of bizarre childhood rules and events at his grandparents' mountain home in the Ozarks, which ultimately led to the most traumatic moment in his life, the moment he realized monsters are real. This is the Unexplained Encounters podcast. I sleep with the fan on every single night, regardless of the reason, no matter the temperature. A box fan runs on the floor next to my bed at full speed. My wife thinks it's a white noise thing, something to help me sleep. She's gotten used to it over the years. She bought me one of those sound machines for Christmas a couple years back. It plays ocean waves and rain and all that stuff, and I thanked her. But I put it in the closet and kept on using the fan. She never asked why, but I'm sure she wondered. I think she could tell by my face that I didn't want to explain. I'm 34 years old. I've slept with a box fan on since I was 11, and I'll probably sleep with one on until the day I die. This is not a comfort thing. At least, not in the way you expect. I've never told anyone the full version of what I'm about to write down. Not even my wife. I've explained parts, yeah, like during a particularly bad night terror that had me standing in the hallway at 3 a.m. with my hands against the wall, like I was bracing for something to hit the house, and my wife found me there, asking what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't remember, I said, but that was a lie. Not too long ago, my grandfather passed away. He was 91 years old, lived a full life, and had been in a wheelchair for the last 12 years. A stroke had taken most of his left side. At the funeral, I was standing by the coffee and those little crustless sandwiches that only exist at church receptions when my cousin Parker walked up, and without any preamble or greeting, he leaned in and said, "You remember that night?" It wasn't a question, and I didn't treat it like one. I simply nodded, and we stood still for a while, until his wife called him over to deal with one of his kids, and that was it. We haven't talked about it since. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't shake something loose. So here it is. My grandfather owned 130 acres in the Ozarks. Most of it backed up to Mark Twain National Forest land, in a part of southern Missouri where the nearest grocery store was a 40-minute drive, and the nearest hospital was further than that. He had retired from the Missouri Pacific Railroad before I was born, and he spent his days doing whatever he wanted on that land, which mostly meant tinkering with small engines and sitting on his porch, growing tomatoes that he'd give away to anyone who stopped by. He was no farmer, though people sometimes assumed he was. He just had land, and he liked having it, and he kept it the way some men keep their guns, maintained and ready, though ready for what was never entirely clear to me as a child. The house was old, but solid. He and my grandmother had built it in 1961 with money he'd saved from the railroad, and it looked like what it was: a post-war rural home designed by people who valued function but had a limited interest in aesthetics. Single-story, partial basement, wood-paneled walls inside that had darkened over the decades to the color of strong tea. It smelled of coffee grounds and something chemically that I eventually identified as mothballs, which were stuffed into the closets. The porch wrapped around two sides and had a concrete floor that was always gritty underfoot. There were two rocking chairs out there that had worn smooth grooves into the concrete from decades of use. The property itself was mostly open yard around the house, maybe 2 acres of mowed grass, then the tree line on 3 sides. The fourth side was the gravel driveway, a quarter-mile of loose rock that popped under tires and announced every arrival long before you could see the vehicle. Beyond the driveway was just more trees. A barn sat about 200 yards from the house, listing to the south. It had stayed like that for as long as I'd been alive, as though it had decided 30 years ago how far it was willing to lean and had just committed to it. There was a creek that cut through the back portion of the property, where the woods thickened up, and in the summer it ran shallow enough to wade in, and deep enough in a few spots to sit down in up to your chest. Every summer, my parents sent me and my cousins out there for 2 or 3 weeks. Parker was 2 years older than me, fearless in a stupid way, and I say that with the most love possible. Leia was my age, quiet, and loved reading books more than anything. Sometimes baby Derek would come too. He was Aunt Diane's youngest, maybe 4 or 5 years old during the years I'm talking about, but he was mostly just a background presence, trailing after the rest of us and crying when he couldn't keep up. During the day, that property was the best place on earth. I genuinely believed that. We had the run of the entire 100+ acres, and we used every inch of it. I remember catching crawdads in the creek with our bare hands, racing them on the flat rocks. We explored that barn hundreds of times, which was full of old equipment and barn swallows, and rusty junk that felt like pirate treasure to a 9-year-old. Grandpa even had an old 3-wheeler ATV. Yeah, if you didn't know, you could get a 3-wheeler back then. They were a bit more common than what you might see today, because they were soon considered way too dangerous. But back then he would let Parker drive it around the property while the rest of us clung to the back like it was a mechanical bull. Grandma kept a drawer in the kitchen full of candy too. Off-brand candy though, mostly. Most of it being butterscotch discs and peppermints. But occasionally, if you're lucky, there would be Snickers in there, hidden away specifically for the kids. Those really were the good days. I want to be clear about that. Those days were genuinely wonderful. It was the nights that were different. I've spent a long time trying to articulate exactly how the shift happened each evening, and the best I can describe it is that my grandfather had an internal clock that the rest of us could not see or hear, and around 5 or 6 o'clock every day, it would go off, and he would become a different person. Now hold on there, he didn't get mean, he didn't yell or become harsh. He just sort of went somewhere else inside himself. You could see it in the way he moved. He would straighten up from whatever he was doing, and his eyes would go to the sky like he was reading something written up there in a language meant just for him. His jaw would start to clench repeatedly, and then he would herd all the kids inside. The rule was that we had to be in the house before the first star appeared in the sky. Not before sunset, which would have been reasonable, but before the first star. In June in Missouri, the sun doesn't fully set until around 9 o'clock, but the first stars can show up in the east while the western sky is still pale. And Grandpa knew this. He watched for them every night with a patience that bordered on obsession. He would sit on the porch in his rocking chair and face east, just waiting. And the moment he saw that first pinpoint of light, wherever we were on the property, he wanted us inside. If we were down at the creek, he'd ring the iron bell mounted on the porch post. A real cast iron bell, too, the kind you would see at old schoolhouses, and you could hear it across the entire property. That sound meant now. It did not mean start heading back. It didn't mean get an attitude or argue. It meant get your butt inside. Once inside, the house changed too. Grandpa would go room to room pulling down the blinds, and these were not typical blinds. Every window in that house had thick, opaque roller shades, the heavy kind that you might find in a dark room or a hospital room where a patient needed total darkness. They were mounted inside the window frames, and when you pulled them down, they sealed the glass almost completely. No light got in, and I suppose more importantly, no light got out. He pulled every single one of them down every single night, without exception, and we were not allowed to raise them or peek behind them until morning. He never explained why. It was simply the rule, and in that house, his rules had the weight of physics. You didn't question gravity, and you didn't question Grandpa. The doors were another thing. He had a deadbolt on every exterior door, which, for a rural house in the middle of nowhere, was already unusual. But the front door also had a chain lock and a sliding barrel bolt that he had installed himself, a heavy steel piece that seated into a bracket that he had lag-bolted directly onto the door frame. Every night, I'd hear him making his rounds. The back door first, then the side door off the kitchen, then the front. Click, click, thunk, slide. The same order every time. The sounds of the house being sealed. And then there were the fans. Every bedroom had a box fan. The cheap kind you could grab at a hardware store for $12 or so, with plastic blades and a rattling motor, and 3 speed settings that were basically loud, louder, and broken sounding. In the room where the kids slept, a guest room with 2 twin beds and a folding cot, Grandpa would set the fan on a wooden chair between the beds and turn it on high before we went to bed. It roared. It pushed air around that didn't need pushing. The house did have central air conditioning that worked fine. The fan would dry out your eyes and your throat so that by morning you'd wake up feeling like you slept in a kiln. Parker hated it and complained about it every summer. Leia slept with a pillow over her face to block the wind. I would just pull the sheet up to my nose and breathed through the fabric, and I dealt with it. One summer, Parker asked Grandma directly why we had to sleep with the fans on. She said the house got stuffy at night and the fans helped circulate the air. Parker pointed out that the air conditioning was literally running, and Grandma gave him a look that was pleasant on the surface, but had something underneath it. Something that communicated very clearly that this line of questioning was finished. Then she said, "Your grandpa likes the fans on, so the fans stay on." And that they did. I understand now what the fans were for. I've understood this since I was 11. The fans were loud enough to cover the sounds from outside. Almost. That was their entire purpose. They were there so it was harder to hear what was walking around the house at night. I should tell you about the moon. There's a specific memory I keep coming back to, from a summer when I was 8 or maybe 9 years old. I was sitting on the porch with Grandpa after dinner, while the sky was doing its long summer fade from orange to purple, and the moon was rising in the east, enormous and nearly full, a deep amber color. I said something about it, like, "Look at that moon," or maybe, "The moon's huge tonight." At first, I didn't think my grandpa was going to say anything. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and he didn't look happy about it, like I was. Eventually, he said to me, as if I wasn't even there, "I hate that damned thing." I thought he was joking around. I even laughed, but it came out awkward and forced. He didn't laugh. Over the years, I started to notice a pattern without fully understanding it. Grandpa was worse on certain nights, and it took me a long time to connect those nights to the moon because I was a kid and I wasn't tracking lunar cycles for fun. But looking back, the pattern was unmistakable. On nights when the moon was full, he was tense and vigilant, more alert than usual and more watchful, up later than Grandma. On nights where there was no moon at all, when the sky was just a black field of stars with no light to speak of, he was something else entirely. He was afraid. I don't think I had a word for it when I was young, but that's what it was. On moonless nights, my grandfather was a man in the grip of a real, grinding fear. He would check the locks more than once. He'd sit in the living room long after everyone else went to bed. And come morning, he would look gray and hollowed out, like someone who had spent the night awake and watching for something that might or might not come. Some nights, despite that fan, I could hear things. The fan covered a lot, yes, but it didn't cover everything. And on certain nights, there were footsteps outside that house. They were slow footsteps pacing around, like someone circling something else, taking their time. It would move along one side of the house, pause, sometimes right outside our bedroom window. A pause long enough that I'd be holding my breath in bed, eyes open, seeing nothing because of those blackout blinds, thankfully, and then continue on around the next side. When I mentioned it at breakfast once, doing my best to sound casual about it, Grandma would smile and said that Grandpa had trouble sleeping and he liked to walk the property at night. Said he was checking the animals in the barn to make sure nothing was getting into the feed. Parker, who was old enough by then to hear an explanation and measure it against what he actually believed, asked what exactly Grandpa was searching or checking for. Grandma changed the subject so smoothly, it was almost a magic trick, and before we knew it, we were talking about what we wanted for lunch. One night, I remember getting up to use the bathroom. I think I was 10 years old. The hallway was dark and the bathroom was on the far side of the living room, which meant I had to walk through the main part of the house to get there. As I passed through the living room, I stopped. Grandpa was in his recliner. The TV was off. Every light in the house was off. He was sitting perfectly upright with his deer rifle laid across his thighs, and his eyes were open, and he was staring at the front door. He didn't look at me. He didn't move. He did not acknowledge me in any way. He sat there like a man who had been sitting there for hours, and intended to sit there for hours more, watching that door with deadly focus, as if he expected it, or prayed that it wouldn't open. I went back to bed, and I listened to the fan and the footsteps outside, and I did not go back to sleep for a long time. The last thing I need to mention before I get to the rest of this is the basement. During the day, the basement was fair game. It was an unfinished space with concrete floor, cinder block walls, exposed ceiling joints, and it held the washer and dryer, a bunch of storage shelves, and a workbench Grandpa used for small projects. It had these narrow slit windows that sit at ground level from the outside, wider than they are tall, hinged at the top so they could swing inward for ventilation. During the day, Grandpa sometimes propped them up to air out the place. After dark, the basement, though, was off limits, and the way Grandpa communicated this was different from his other rules. Those other rules, the blinds, the fans, the inside before stars rule, those were enforced through routine. He just did them and you fell in line because that's how things worked. The basement rule was the only one he ever stated out loud, directly, looking right at us. He said, "You do not go in that basement after the sun goes down." And his face when he said it was not the face of a man setting a household boundary, but rather someone telling you not to put your hand into a running engine. He was not making a rule as much as he was describing a very real danger. For years, that's what summers were. The days were creek water and crawdads and the smell of cut grass and Grandma's fantastic cooking. But the nights were blackout blinds, locked doors, the drone of a box fan drowning out whatever moved in the dark outside. I accepted all of this. I was a kid. It was part of my world. Like Santa Claus, you accepted these kinds of things without analysis. This was Grandpa's house, and these were Grandpa's rules, and the world at Grandpa's house simply worked differently than it did at home. So I never really questioned it, and I followed every rule to the letter, right up until the summer I turned 11. That was the summer Grandpa had his stroke, when the rules came apart, and I finally truly learned what all of it had been for. Now, I know I said the last thing I would mention before the real story would be the basement thing, but there is one more thing I need to tell you before I get to what happened the summer I was 11. This is the story my grandfather told me on the porch. I was around 9 or 10. It was a full moon night. I remember that because the moon was the reason I was outside at all. I couldn't sleep despite the fan, or maybe because of it. My throat felt like sandpaper and I needed some water. When I padded out to the kitchen to get some, I could see through the gap at the bottom of the living room blinds. The porch was lit up silver white, bright enough to read by, and the front door was open to the screen. Obviously, this was all very bizarre. Grandpa never left doors open at night, never had the blinds in a way we could peek through them. But there he was on the other side of the screen door, sitting in his rocker with the rifle across his knees, staring out at the yard and the tree line beyond it in all that cold moonlight. I pushed open the screen door and he looked at me. I expected him to tell me to go back to bed right away, but he didn't do that. He looked very tired. In fact, I'd never seen him so tired. And I want to say it wasn't like a sleepy kind of tired either. The man looked absolutely worn through, a tiredness that went beyond muscles. He studied me for a second, then he tipped his head toward the other rocking chair. I sat down in it with my feet dangling, because I was too short to reach the concrete. We sat there for a while without talking. The moon was so bright it threw hard shadows across the yard, and the tree line at the edge of the mowed grass looked like a wall someone had built out of pure blackness, but then backlit it from the inside with pale gray where the moonlight caught the upper canopy. It was beautiful enough to take your breath away. Every few seconds a bat would cut through the light above the yard, there and gone so quick it was like a glitch in your vision. Then Grandpa began to talk. He didn't look at me when he did, and he didn't raise his voice above a low murmur. It really looked like he was talking to himself rather than to me. He told me a story, and I'm going to relay it here the way I can remember it, which means it might have gaps or rough edges, because I was a child then when I heard it, and he was not a man who knew how to tell a story in any organized fashion. He was blunt and sparse, with a lot left out that he either assumed you'd fill in or preferred you didn't. So here goes. When my grandfather was young, 20 or 21, he said, something had started getting into the livestock on the properties around his family's land. His father, my great-grandfather, raised cattle, and a few of the neighboring families had cattle or hogs or both. Over the span of maybe a month, Animals started to turn up dead in the fields and pens, and from the way Grandpa described it, dead was putting it generously. He said the animals were taken apart. He used that phrase specifically. Taken apart. Like a mechanic taking apart an engine. Pieces here, pieces there. Organs separated from the body and moved to places they shouldn't be. He said one of the neighbor's heifers was found with its rib cage opened up and emptied out, with the contents arranged in the grass beside it, in what he called a kind of order, though he wouldn't say what that meant, and I wasn't asking. I remember thinking, how is he telling a kid my age all of this? But he kept going. The initial assumption was dogs. Feral dogs were a real problem in that part of the Ozarks. Packs of them could form up out of strays and dumped pets. They could bring down a calf if they were hungry and numerous enough. But the men who looked at the remains said it wasn't dogs, and it wasn't coyotes either. Because dogs and coyotes are messy, frantic killers that tear into whatever they can reach and leave a scattered wreck. Whatever was doing this, it was doing it with a kind of deliberateness, and that did not match any predator that they knew of. Grandpa said his father came back from examining one of the kills and sat at the kitchen table, completely silent. When Grandpa's mother asked him what was wrong, he simply said, "Something's pulling them apart with its hands." Now, nobody called the game warden or the sheriff. This was the rural Ozarks in the early 1950s. These men solved their own problems. My great-grandfather organized a hunt. He put the word out to the surrounding families. Grandpa's Uncle Earl, two men from the next property over whose names I have long forgotten, or maybe I never knew, and a cousin of some kind, who I think was only there mostly because he owned dogs that had been used for tracking boar. In total, there were 5, maybe 6 men, including my grandfather, who was the youngest at the time, and was allowed to come because he owned a rifle too, and knew how to use it, and because his father was not the kind of man you argued with successfully. They went out on a night when the livestock killings had been at their worst. Grandpa said they waited for the moon to be up, so they'd have light. They brought rifles and lanterns and the tracking dogs, 2 of them, big bony hounds with scarred up ears, and they went into the trees behind my great-grandfather's property at around 10 o'clock at night. Grandpa told me about this part of the hunt in pieces, and some of what he said I've had to reconstruct from what I remember, and what makes sense in context. Because, like I said, he was not a natural storyteller, and I was a kid, sitting in the dark, trying to follow an old man's fragmented account of something that happened 40 years before I was born. The dogs lasted about an hour. They went in eager, excited hounds with a scent to follow, heads down and pulling against their leads. But then they stopped, both of them, at nearly the same time. They froze where they stood and began shaking. Grandpa said one of them urinated on itself. They refused to move forward, and they refused to stay quiet. They started to make a sound that he described as a continuous whine, high and thin. Not a game call, but something from when it's gone beyond fear into a place where its brain had stopped working properly. One of the dogs ripped free of its lead and bolted off. They heard it crashing through the underbrush for about 30 seconds, and then the sound faded and they never found that dog. The remaining hound pressed itself against its owner's legs and had to be dragged along for the rest of the night, like a piece of furniture. So after the dogs became useless, the men kept going on their own. They were deep in the timber by this point, in that old-growth Ozark woodland where the canopy closes overhead and the moonlight comes through in patches. Everything between those patches is ink dark. Grandpa said they could hear something moving in the trees around them. He was specific about this part. He said it wasn't moving through the underbrush like a deer or a boar would, pushing through branches at ground level. It was moving above them, in the canopy, He said they could hear branches creaking and snapping up high, the sound of something heavy transferring its weight from limb to limb, and it was fast, much faster than walking pace. He said it circled them for a while, up there in the dark above the lantern light, and the sound of it was like a man running on all fours across treetops, which is an image I've never been able to get out of my head, even though I heard this sitting on a porch 20-some years ago. They kept moving because they were men who had committed to doing something, and because turning back now would have meant walking through the same stretch of forest they had just come through, and whatever was pacing them in the canopy would have still been there. Grandpa said they walked for maybe another half hour, with the sound above them coming and going, sometimes close enough that debris would fall on them, small twigs and bark and pieces of leaf. Other times far enough away that they nearly convinced themselves it had gone. The remaining dog had given up walking entirely and was being carried by its owner. Then, the thing came down out of the trees. Grandpa didn't describe this like a dramatic moment. He said it matter-of-factly, like someone saying it started to rain. The crashing above them stopped, and there was a heavy sound about 40 yards ahead of them, like something landing on the ground from a great height. Then, silence. It was Uncle Earl who saw it first. Earl was at the front of the group, a few paces ahead of the others, carrying a lantern in one hand and his rifle in the other. He stopped walking and said very low without turning around, "It's standing up." Grandpa raised his lantern. At the far edge of the light, about 30 yards out where the glow gave way to solid dark, he could see a shape between two trees. He said it was tall, taller than any of them, and Earl was over 6 feet. It was standing on 2 legs, and it was perfectly still. The lantern light was too weak at that distance to give him anything more than an outline, but he said the outline was enough. He said it looked like someone had taken the general idea of a person and built it after stretching the measurements. He said the head set forward on the neck, reminding him more of a vulture, with a long-looking snout or perhaps a nose, and its shoulders were enormous, far too wide for the head they supported. The arms hung past where arms should stop. Then it dropped forward onto all fours, and it was gone. The sound of its movement exploded back into the canopy above them, crashing through the branches heading north, fast and getting farther away. The men stood there in a circle of lantern light, with their rifles up, and nobody said anything for what Grandpa estimated was about 2 full minutes. They should have gone home. They all knew that. But they didn't, because Uncle Earl said the thing was heading toward the Dawson property, where cattle had been killed the week prior. And because these were Ozark men in the 1950s, and going home would have been something they'd have to live with for a long time, they followed. The timber got worse as they went north. The terrain broke up into ridges and draws and rocky shelves where the footing was bad even in daylight, and the men started to spread out because you couldn't walk 6 abreast through that kind of country. They kept in contact by calling to each other. Grandpa said his father would shout, and the others would shout back, a kind of roll call every few minutes to make sure nobody had fallen or gotten turned around. The thing in the canopy had gone quiet, or at least they couldn't hear it over the sound of their own movement across the rough ground. Suddenly, there was a gunshot, a single sharp crack that bounced off the ridge walls and came from the east, from Uncle Earl's direction, because Earl had drifted the furthest from the group. Grandpa said everyone stopped where they were, and in the silence after the shot, they heard Earl screaming. He was far enough away that the sound was thin and echoing and hard to locate precisely. But it was unmistakably a man screaming in a register that Grandpa said he'd never heard from a grown person before, and never heard again after. Then there was a second shot, which cut off the screaming. Then nothing. Just the trees in the dark, and all of them standing in it. For some time, Grandpa went quiet after he told me that part. He rocked in his chair and looked at the moon, and his hands were still on the rifle across his lap. I could see that even decades later, the memory of that silence after the second shot was costing him something to sit with. I waited because even at 9 or 10, I understood that you don't interrupt a man when he's in a place like that. When he started again, his voice was flatter. He said they'd found Earl's rifle at the bottom of a draw, wedged between two rocks. It had been fired twice, both rounds spent. There was blood on the rocks and on the ground, a lot of it, and there were drag marks leading down into a ravine so choked with brush and fallen timber that they couldn't push through it in the dark. They stood at the edge of that ravine, calling Earl's name until the sky started to lighten up in the east. My grandfather didn't tell me what they found when they went back in daylight. He said, "They told his wife it was an animal attack." I noticed that phrasing even then, young as I was. They told her. He didn't say it was an animal attack. He told me what they told her it was, and the gap between those two things was wide enough to fall into. The official family story, the one I'd heard at Thanksgiving tables and funerals my whole life, without knowing it had any connection to my grandfather's property, was that Earl had died in a hunting accident, had shot himself, and by the time the search party had reached him, animals had gotten to the remains. A tragedy, but the kind of tragedy that happened in the rural Ozarks. People accepted it, because it was the kind of thing that could be accepted. Grandpa sat with me for a while longer after he finished. The moon had moved since he'd started talking, and the shadows in the yard had shifted with it. The tree line looked different than before. Not to say it was menacing, exactly, but more aware. Like when you walk in a room and you didn't know that someone was in there and they never announce themselves. You simply see them suddenly. Eventually, he looked at me, and his eyes were clear and direct. He said, "There's something in those woods that doesn't have a name, and it's smarter than you want it to be. That's why we have the rules. You understand?" I nodded. "The worst nights are the new moons," he said. "On a full moon you can see it coming. On a new moon, it can see you, and you can't see a thing." He told me to go back to bed then, and I went. I pulled the sheet up to my nose, and I listened to the box fan roar. But I did not go back to sleep that night. In the morning, I looked out the window at the tree line in the early sunlight. It was just trees, the very same trees I'd played under the day before. But now they meant something completely different. After that night on the porch, I never doubted or wondered about the rules again. I would pull the blinds down myself, turn the fan on before anyone told me to, and I would be the first inside before the first star even showed, every single time without being asked. The footsteps outside some nights that Grandma said were Grandpa checking on the animals. I knew what those were now. My grandfather was not inspecting the barn. Grandpa wasn't even outside. Something in those woods had taken my grandfather's uncle apart in a ravine 40 years ago, and it was still here. I understood the rules. I followed the rules. And those rules kept us safe every summer of my childhood, until the summer my grandfather collapsed in his kitchen with a mug of coffee shattering on the linoleum and the left side of his body going slack. Suddenly, the only person who truly knew what the rules were for was unconscious and driven to a hospital. Grandpa's stroke happened one morning in the middle of our second week during that stay. He was standing at the counter pouring coffee from the percolator, the same thing he did every morning at the same time, and his left hand simply opened on its own and let the mug fall. It hit the floor, breaking into 3 pieces, and coffee went everywhere. Grandpa looked down at it, then looked at Grandma and said, "Joyce, there's something wrong with my arm." Then he sat down in a kitchen chair heavily, like someone had increased the gravity in the room, and the left side of his face slid downward and stayed there. Grandma called 911. She called Aunt Diane too, who lived 4 hours away in the suburbs outside St. Louis. Then she did what she could, which was to hold Grandpa's right hand and talk to him in a steady voice while the 3 of us stood in the kitchen doorway, watching, not knowing what to do with ourselves. I remember that the ambulance took a long time to get there. That's how far out we were from anything. They loaded Grandpa onto a stretcher. He looked so small and frail. I remember thinking that my grandpa might die, and I was scared. This man, who had been the largest presence in every room he ever entered, now looked like a gray-faced old man with only one working hand. Grandma couldn't go with him, not until Aunt Diane came, and once Aunt Diane showed up, Grandma left in a hurry. I remember just after she left, looking at the blinds on the windows, thinking that no one in this house would know to pull them down, and why. Aunt Diane and her husband Cal arrived around 3 in the afternoon, hugging Grandma and wishing her and Grandpa the best as she left. Aunt Diane was Grandpa's youngest daughter, a very sweet woman with a loud laugh who worked as an office manager somewhere. She drove a minivan and had probably not spent a full night in this house in 15 years. Uncle Cal was fine, a big, soft-spoken guy who sold insurance and was decent with kids. He gave lots of those cheesy kid compliments and high fives, like "good job, sport," that kind of thing. They were the kind of adults you'd want around during a family emergency, for sure. Warm and capable. Aunt Diane spent most of the evening on the phone with the hospital and with other relatives, leading a sort of crisis management with the family. Uncle Cal ordered pizza from the one place that would actually deliver that far out, which took over an hour. He even let us eat it in the living room in front of the TV, which Grandma never allowed. That first evening, I kept waiting for someone to start the routine, hoping someone was watching the sky and would call us inside if we were outside, or go room to room with the blinds, setting up fans, locking doors. But nobody did. The sun went down and the windows stayed uncovered, and the doors stayed latched with their regular locks, not with the deadbolts. No chain, no barrel bolt, nothing. The fans stayed in the closet where Grandma stored them during the day. That house felt utterly naked, like a body without skin. Everything that was supposed to be protected was now open and exposed to whatever was out there. I almost said something. I stood in the hallway and rehearsed it in my head. Something about how Grandpa liked the blinds down and the fans on. Something casual that wouldn't require me to explain why. But I couldn't figure out how to say it without sounding strange. I was 11 years old, but the weight of adult attention during a crisis was paralyzing, so I didn't say anything. I went to bed in the guest room with Parker and Leia. The window was uncovered, and the fan was off. I lay there in the most awkward silence, so enormous and wrong, I could hear my own heartbeat. I slept eventually. The following day was almost normal. Uncle Cal took us outside. We rode the three-wheeler and threw rocks in the creek, and Aunt Diane drove to the hospital, coming back in the late afternoon with a cautiously optimistic report. Grandpa was stable, responsive, but they were keeping him for observation and tests. There was also talk of moving him to a larger facility in Springfield. She looked exhausted. Uncle Cal made spaghetti for dinner. It was watery and undersalted, but we all ate it. Nobody had the energy to care about food quality at the time. That evening, Parker pulled me and Leia aside in the hallway. I could tell he was being very sneaky about something. "They don't care what we do," he said, meaning Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal, who were back on the phone in the master bedroom with the door mostly shut. "We should stay outside tonight, after dark. We're never going to get that chance again." Leia looked at me. I could tell she wanted me to say no so she wouldn't have to. And I nearly did. But Parker was 13 and I was 11. At that age, that's a big gap. And some part of me, the side that was tired of being so afraid every summer, tired of the fans and the blinds and the locked down feeling of Grandpa's nighttime house, that side wanted to know what the property was like after dark. I'd spent years sealed inside while the world outside continued without me, and I wanted to see it. So I said okay, and Leia said okay because I had, and Parker grinned. We went out the back door at around 8:30, with the sky still holding on to the last orange glow in the west, but the east had already gone to deep blue. The very first thing that struck me was how different the property sounded at night. The creek, which was a pleasant background murmur during the day, was loud, more present, so to speak, in the dark, even aggressive sounding. The bugs were deafening, a whole wall of sound from every direction, cicadas and crickets and tree frogs layering over each other in a pulsing roar that seemed to breathe. And underneath all that was the woods. The tree line was about 60 yards from where we stood at the back of the house, and in the dying light, it looked solid, a dark mass without depth or detail. We had flashlights, 2 of them, from the kitchen junk drawer, but both were so weak that they barely reached 20 feet. Parker swept his across the yard like a searchlight. It revealed a narrow cone of grass and bugs, but nothing more. Beyond that cone was just more dark. He started to walk toward the tree line. Leia and I followed, too scared to be away from our oldest member. For about 20 minutes, it was what Parker had promised, an adventure. We walked along the edge of the trees without going in, shining our flashlights into the first few yards of timber, seeing trunks and underbrush. Occasionally, we found a pair of tiny reflective eyes, probably belonging to some small or low-to-the-ground raccoon or possum. Parker kept up a running commentary during this, about how this wasn't even scary, and that Grandpa's rules were just an old man being paranoid. I let him say those things because I simply didn't know what to say, and I liked the lack of silence. Suddenly, Leia stopped. She was slightly behind me and to my left. When I turned around, she was standing very still with her flashlight pointed at the tree line, about 40 yards south of where we were. Her flashlight was weak, and it barely reached the trees at that distance. But at the very edge of its throw, where the light gave up and the dark took over again, there was a shape between 2 trunks that I could not make sense of. It was taller than any of us by a significant margin. It was also narrow, standing on 2 legs, but it was completely motionless. The flashlight was much too dim to give any texture or color, so it remained a silhouette, a vertical interruption in the pattern of the trees behind it, and it was facing us. "Something standing there," Leia said. Her voice was perfectly calm. Parker swung his flashlight toward it. For half a second, both beams hit roughly the same area, and in that combined light, I saw, or I thought I saw, the shape shift, a sudden movement, quickly, like something rearranging its posture. Leia's light flickered then. These were cheap, battery-powered flashlights. In that half second of reduced light, The shape was gone. Just trees. Just ordinary dark between tree trunks. Parker said it was a deer. He said it with enough conviction that I knew he didn't believe it. And I think Leia knew too, because she was already walking toward the house, and she was walking fast. We followed her, and how we kept from actually full-on running, I have no idea. Perhaps we were too scared to run, but we walked at a pace that was as close to running as you could get. And when we made it to the back door and went inside, shutting it behind us, Parker locked the knob lock and then stood there looking at the deadbolt above it. He looks at us, then half laughs, saying, "It'll be fine." So we left it unlocked, and we didn't say anything else about it. We stood in the kitchen, breathing harder than the walk justified, and Parker then said, "That was fun." But Leia and I stayed quiet. He then said, "We should sleep down in the basement tonight." I felt my stomach drop when he said it. The basement was the other rule, the one Grandpa had spoken out loud with his eyes locked on mine, and hearing Parker propose breaking it felt like hearing someone suggest swimming in a river during a storm. But Parker was already talking about it like it was decided. He'd seen the old Nintendo down there, he said, when Aunt Diane had gone down to do laundry earlier. And there were games, and probably other stuff. And the basement was cool, and it would be like a fort. And he reiterated, when would we get another chance? I looked at Leia. She had her arms crossed over her chest, and she was staring at the floor. We were both wondering the same thing, I think. How much resistance was worth the cost of Parker's ridicule? She must have arrived at the same answer I did, because she shrugged one shoulder and said, "Whatever." And Parker took that as unanimous consent and started gathering supplies. We brought sleeping bags and pillows from the guest room. Parker grabbed a bag of chips and 3 cans of Coke from the fridge. Leia brought a book, which was optimistic. We trooped down the wooden stairs into the basement, and Parker pulled the chain on the single bare bulb at the bottom. The room came to life in harsh yellowish light. Everything else was concrete and shadow. Honestly, for a few hours though, it was great. Parker found the NES under the workbench, still connected to a small TV that must have been old when Reagan was president, and after 20 minutes of blowing into cartridges and fiddling with the AV cables, he got it to work. We played Excitebike, then Duck Hunt without the light gun, just using the controller, which didn't work perfectly, but we didn't mind. Leia found a stack of board games on a shelf, Sorry and Clue and something called Aggravation that none of us had ever heard of. We played Clue on the concrete floor with the chips and soda spread around us, like we were having a picnic. Parker discovered a cabinet near the water heater that contained, among other things, a collection of candy so old that some of it was in packaging I didn't recognize. We tried a few pieces. They tasted like sweetened chalk. We ate them anyway, because adventure was the whole point. Really, it was the most fun I'd had at that house in years, maybe ever. We were loud and stupid and free, and Aunt Diane and Uncle Cal never came down to check on us. For those few hours, the basement was just a basement, and the rules we were used to, they were just the eccentricities of an old man who was currently in a hospital bed 40 minutes away with tubes in his arm. We fell asleep in stages. Leia went first. She had set up her sleeping bag near the base of the stairs and was out cold by midnight. Parker lasted a little longer on the sagging couch against the far wall, talking to me about a girl from his school, while his sentences got slower and more fragmented, until they stopped entirely, and his breathing evened out. I lay in my sleeping bag in the middle of the floor. I was between the two of them, looking up at the ceiling joists and the cobwebs, listening to the silence. No fan, just silence. I hadn't really thought about that part until that very moment. I'd been distracted by the games and the food and the novelty of it all. But lying there in the dark after Parker killed the light, the silence of that basement was absolute. no fan roar to fill the space, and no white noise to blur the edges of whatever sounds the night might be making. There was, though, the faint ticking of the water heater, and the even fainter hum of the electrical panel on the wall. But beyond that, nothing. I listened to my cousin's breathing. It was so dark and so quiet. It felt like I was deep, deep underwater. Eventually, and I don't know when, I fell asleep. But when I woke up, I was very cold. Genuinely cold. A damp chill had gotten through the sleeping bag and into my skin. It made no sense because it was July in Missouri, and the basement had been stuffy and warm when we'd come down. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around myself. That's when I felt the draft. Moving air coming from somewhere to my left, carrying a smell that did not belong in that basement. The green, wet smell of outside, of grass and dirt and night air, and underneath it was something else. A warm and sour and biological smell. It reminded me of a dog's breath, but heavier and denser, more concentrated. One of the slit windows was open. I couldn't see it. The dark in that basement was the most complete dark I'd ever experienced, where open and closed eyes were the same thing. But I could feel the outside air coming through it. I could feel that the air was wrong, that it carried the heat and smell of something that was not the night. And every hair on my body stood up at once. I heard it before I could even make sense of it. Breathing. Low and wet, raspy on the exhale. A large animal trying to keep quiet. Something was in the room with us. Something was inside the basement. And it was breathing. It was close. I stopped moving, and I stopped breathing. Every muscle in my body locked into a rigid, frozen state that I did not choose and could not have overridden if I'd tried. My higher brain, the part that reasons and plans and makes decisions, had been disconnected from the controls entirely, and what was running me now was something much older, much simpler. Something that said to me, you must not move, you must not breathe, you must no longer exist. The breathing shifted. It moved through the room, slowly, with a carefulness that was worse than speed, because speed would mean a panicked animal, and this was not panicked. It was methodical. And beneath that breathing, accompanying it, I heard the footsteps, a light, clicking, tapping cadence on the concrete floor. The sound of something with claws, walking on a hard surface. And the rhythm. It didn't match anything that walks on two legs, but it didn't quite match anything that walks on four. The sound of it moving across the concrete floor in the perfect dark was the most alien and dislocating thing I've ever heard. It moved past me. Close enough that I could feel warmth coming off of it, the radiant body heat of something large and very alive, and I caught a wave of that smell, that sour, biological, overly wet dog smell. But up close, it was sharper, and there was more underneath it, something that reminded me of blood. It passed within what had to be 2 or 3 feet of my sleeping bag. And I lay there with my eyes wide open in the dark, and I saw absolutely nothing. I felt it go by me, like a weather system. Then it stopped, near the couch where Parker had been sleeping. I heard the breathing change then, faster, shorter, with a sniffing quality, like it was sampling the air around him. Then it moved again, toward the stairs, toward Leia. It stopped. The breathing was maybe 4 feet from my head, 4 feet from Leia's sleeping bag at the base of the stairs. I could hear her slow, unconscious breathing, and the thing's breathing layered over it, and for a span of time that I cannot accurately estimate. Was it 5 seconds, 30, a full minute? Those were the only sounds in the world. Then the thing made a sound, a low and soft sound from deep in its chest, barely louder than the breathing. It wasn't a growl, and it wasn't a whine. It sat somewhere between the two, carrying an emotion I should not have been able to read, but I could. It was interested. Whatever was standing over my cousin in the dark was curious about her. Leia shifted in her sleeping bag, a small, unconscious movement, the kind of half-roll that sleeping people do, and she made a sound, a murmur, maybe a fragment of a dream, nothing coherent. But then her eyes opened. No, I couldn't see it. I knew because she spoke then. Her voice was muzzy and confused and half asleep, and I heard her say, "Is that a dog? Who let a—" The rest of her sentence was replaced by a sound that I will hear for the rest of my life. A sudden detonation of movement, claws scrabbling on concrete, a heavy wet impact of a body hitting the sleeping bag, and the sound of the bag being seized and wrenched sideways across the floor so quickly that Leia's confused question turned into a scream that did not sound like language or even a human voice anymore. Just a raw and primal shriek of an animal in terror. It bounced off the concrete walls, filling the basement from floor to ceiling. I heard the sleeping bag dragging, fast, impossibly fast, scraping across the concrete toward the far wall where the open window was. Trust me, I would soon know where that open window was exactly. I could hear Leia thrashing about inside the sleeping bag. The thing had hold of the outside of it and was pulling her. I could hear the fabric tearing in long, ripping sounds as claws and teeth shredded through the outer shell. Parker was screaming from the couch, "What's happening?" And somewhere above us, through the ceiling, I heard the concussive thud of adult feet hitting the floor and running. The dragging reached the wall, and there was a different sound. The sleeping bag being hauled upward, lifted off the ground toward the slit window. The window frame groaned. Leia was screaming in short, breathless bursts, and I could hear the fabric of the sleeping bag catching at the edges of the window, tearing further. I understood, with a sick, lurching horror, that whatever had her was trying to pull her through that window. An 18-inch wide slit window, 4 feet off the basement floor on the inside, but ground level on the outside. Something out there was hauling a child in a sleeping bag up the wall, attempting to drag her through it with the disturbing strength of something I don't want to share a world with. The basement light suddenly came on. Aunt Diane had hit the switch at the top of the stairs, and the bare bulb exploded the room back into existence. Every detail was harsh and yellow again, and suddenly, violently real. I saw the basement, the scattered sleeping bags and the crushed chip bag, the Ness still connected to the silent TV. Parker was now standing on top of the couch, his back against the wall. His face was white and his mouth was wide open. His hands were up near his chest, like he was bracing for a hit. And across the room, against the far wall, there was Leia's sleeping bag, hanging. The top half was wedged into the open slit window, pulled upward and bunched into the narrow frame. The bottom half hung down the wall, limp, with Leia's weight inside it sagging toward the floor. The bag was shredded in long lines, 4 slashes evenly spaced across, and through the tears I could see the color of Leia's pajamas and even the skin of her arm. She wasn't moving or screaming anymore. She had gone silent, so absolutely terrified she'd stopped moving. Then the bag dropped. Whatever had been holding it from outside released it all at once, and Leia and the sleeping bag collapsed to the basement floor in a heap. From outside the window, inches away, just on the other side of that ground-level slit, I heard something move, a single heavy thud, the sound of a large animal pushing off the grass, heading back for the tree line, leaving us there in the aftermath. Uncle Cal came down the stairs 3 at a time, his face aghast. He grabbed Leia off the floor, sleeping bag and all, and carried her rapidly up the stairs. Aunt Diane was behind him, one hand on the wall, the other over her mouth, asking questions. Parker scrambled off the couch and ran for the stairs. I saw him glancing at the still open window several times as he did. I was the last one up. As I reached the bottom step, I too turned and looked back at that window. It was still open, swinging slightly inward on its hinge. Beyond it, through the narrow rectangle of the opening, I could see a strip of the yard due to the light that spilled out from the basement. There was grass, the first few feet of ground outside, and at the edge of the light already pulling back into the dark, there was a pair of eyes. They were low to the ground and caught the basement light like an animal's. A yellow reflective shine. They were close together, but that's all I could see due to the dark. They looked at me for less than a second, but then they were gone, and I swear I could hear the sound of something moving fast through the woods. I ran up the stairs, and I didn't go back down. Leia was physically fine. There were some light scratches from the window frame on her arms and shoulders, a bruise across her ribs where she'd been pinned inside the sleeping bag as it was pulled against the narrow opening. But nothing was broken, nothing that would leave a scar on the outside. Uncle Cal went out with a flashlight, walking the perimeter of the house, while Aunt Diane sat with us in the living room with every light on. Uncle Cal came back about 15 minutes later, said he couldn't find a thing. He started to explain it. It was a bear, he said, attracted to the smell of the food we'd brought down there. And I could see in his face that he was constructing something that he could believe, not something that was currently true, but something that would become true. There was no more sleep to be had that night. We stayed up in the living room together until dawn, with the TV on and the volume up, every light on in the house. Leia sat in the corner of the couch with her knees pulled to her chest and did not speak, nor would she speak in the morning or the morning after that, and she would not talk to me or the rest of us for the remainder of that summer. Aunt Diane called the hospital that night. She was in the kitchen and she was keeping her voice low, but I was in the hallway and I heard most of it. She described what happened. She used the word animal several times and the word window several more. When she stopped, there was some silence, long enough that Aunt Diane said, "Mom, are you there?" But then my grandmother's voice came through, and I could hear what she asked. She had said, "Were the windows closed?" That was her first question. Not if Leia was okay, or what happened, but about the windows. It was like she knew exactly what would have happened if the windows were not locked, or if someone had gone down into the basement where the windows didn't lock. Grandma, like Grandpa, probably knew what was out there, but did not have the first-hand experience like Grandpa had. Grandpa would not have forgotten to lock the place down. But Grandma, in a panic, well, I can't blame her. This was not her fault. I really can't say it was anyone's fault. We were driven home 2 days later. Our summer was over. I hope that makes you understand why the sound of a box fan brings me some sort of comfort, or security might be a better word, because my mind has subconsciously associated things with that event. It knows that before the attack, there was box fan noise when we slept, but on the night of the attack, there was none. So until the day I die, there will be a box fan running full blast in my room, because I do not want to hear what's lurking outside my window. What in the world was that? What kind of creature resembles a thin and sickly werewolf, but can fit through a thin window to drag away children? This story is going to give me nightmares for weeks to come. Good night. Thank you all so much for joining me on my podcast here, called Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. You can listen to and review Unexplained Encounters on your favorite podcast app, such as Spotify or Apple Podcasts and so on. It's super helpful. You can find all my narrations on YouTube at Darkness Prevails. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.